Good morning. First, I want to thank you all for coming, and thanks to our speakers, and like all of us who are missing our beautiful morning outside, to be here with us. And thanks to my SOLA board who have been working on this important program and who you will meet a little later. I also want to acknowledge and thank Rich McDaniel for managing our IT needs and award-winning photographer Peggy Douglas, who will be here taking photos. And thanks to Mary Beth D'Amico and the rest of the Rehoboth Beach Elementary School staff who have just been wonderful in helping us throughout this whole organization process. I am Sally Foreman, president of SOLA3, which I founded in 2004. Our primary mission is to work with Delaware's Department of Natural Resources Environmental Control, known as DNREC, and others to restore, maintain, and protect our Rehoboth lakes, Silver Lake, Lake Comegys, and Lake Girard. This is no easy task, considering the Delaware waterways are among the worst in the nation for pollutants from fecal bacteria, nitrogen and phosphorus, pesticides, PCBs, and dioxins, according to research from the Environmental Integrity Project. Furthermore, Delaware has lost over 50% of its wetlands and subaqueous lands over the last 30 years, which are so important to reducing flooding. These natural resources are also threatened by climate change and sea level rise. The slide you see on this screen in the pale blue, there's a lot of blue up there, but I think you can recognize the areas that will be inundated by, particularly by flooding as a result of these natural disasters. But these threats go beyond our lakes and extend throughout our communities. Today, our keynote speaker is Tony Pratt. He is well known throughout our community because of his outstanding 38 career with DNREC, where he served as the administrator of Shoreline and Waterway Management Section, retiring from that position in 2018. His responsibilities include oversight of programs related to beach nourishment, beach construction regulation, coastal hazards and mitigation, waterway management, flood mitigation, and storm response and recovery issues for communities. Currently, he is a consultant specializing in marine erosion and sediment deposit issues, sea level rise impacts, coastal communities resilience, waterway management issues, and coastal government affairs programs related to beach nourishment and beach construction regulation. He is the executive director and former president of the American Shore and Beach Preservation Association, a national organization dedicated to preserving, protecting, and enhancing the beaches, shores, and other local resources of the United States. He also serves on the advisory board to the Department of Homeland Security Coastal Resilience Center of Excellence based at UNC Chapel Hill. In addition to his outstanding resume, I also learned while searching for a contact for Tony that he is a very accomplished photographer featuring beautiful photos of our local natural resources and wildlife. What Tony presents today really sets the stage for the theme of our program, water, water everywhere. But that water that we treasure for recreation and their beauty, at least on the surface, can only present dangers to our community. Tony?
Thank you, Sally. I appreciate that. Nice to see everybody on a Saturday morning. I'm going to put my glasses on. I don't normally speak from notes, but I'm doing this today for a specific reason. Sally contacted me based in large part on a presentation I made to the Rehoboth Planning Commission a couple of years ago around the time that they were redoing the comprehensive plan. And I had 3 questions that were asked of me to address in that forum. It was a Saturday morning, I think, something like this, and there were a few folks sitting around a table, and we had a very informal conversation. And they asked me to address 3 issues. Sea level rise causes, sea level rise impacts, and storminess, particularly coastal storms, but also rain events. And with that setup of those 3 issues to talk about, I went back and with some embarrassment, I went back and looked at the tape of myself. I don't like to do that. But I extemporaneously talked for over an hour. So I'm not going to do that today, I promise you. So Sally, get the hook ready. If I ramble, you can. I thought I was. Good like this? Better? All right. I'm sorry. Should I start again? No. I want to briefly discuss those same issues today. I think that's really why I'm here, is to discuss sea level rise, what's causing it a little bit. We're not going to get into the physics of sea level rise particularly, but there are some interesting things. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the impacts. I'm going to talk a little bit about storminess. But to set the table, I think, for today's discussions and really the outcome of what we're talking about today as a community, and it's a dialogue, it is a conversation. But to set the table for that, I think we have to talk a little bit about how we assume and address risk as individuals and as communities. Because really that's what we're looking at is risk assessment and directly addressing risk and reducing risks, whatever they may be. So, a little bit about what is risk assessment. In my career with DNREC and some of the organizations, I've worked with the National Academies, I've worked with the Heinz Center. As I said, as Casali introduced me, I am currently the executive director of the American Shore and Beach Preservation Association. And I find in the world that I've worked in, which is coastal protection, landform protection is primarily beach nourishment, has been a major thing that we've accomplished in this nation and locally very much so. But it really gets to community resilience, the ability of a community to respond from a disaster, get back on its feet very quickly, and being prepared to do that. And in order to do that properly, I think we have to look at how we address risk. And we all accept risk every day. Getting out of bed in the morning, you accept risk. You might step on a sock or a child or a pet's toy and you could fall down. So you're accepting risk throughout the day. Getting in your car and driving here, you accepted a risk. We know that people sometimes have accidents and break down. But we do as a society, both at the local level, individually, those of us personally within a family structure, whatever it might be, we accept risk and we invest against it. We do things like have better tires on our car. I will admit that sometimes I look at the tread of my tires and I say, I can wait a year and put those off and replace those tires in a year. So sometimes we put off addressing risk. And that's an important component of why sometimes the things we value, we get to evaluation process of what risk, what issues should we be addressing as a society and individually. And how do we get to that decision-making process? And that's really what I want to spend about 10 to 15 minutes talking a little bit about. Looking at risk acceptance from a community level as well as from a individual level. But I'm going to start that conversation, go back to the forces that we're dealing with, the changes in climate they're dealing with. And so my background way a long time ago, back in the 70s, I have something of a degree in geology, bachelor's degree, and I worked in this world of coastal dynamics for, at this point, knocking on the door 50 years. And going back to working at the University of Massachusetts after I graduated from Hampshire College in Amherst, Massachusetts in 1975. And we understand the physics of what's going on a weekly basis, an annual basis, but sea level has been rising. We're in what's called an interglacial. Climatologists, geologists would tell you that we had a peak of the last ice age that peaked out about 15,000 years ago, and since then the climate has been warming. The history of the Earth, it has cooled and warmed many, many, many times. Some of those fundamental drivers are not well understood. So when we talk about sea level rise, we have to put it in the context in my world that we've been looking at sea level rise. We've been experiencing sea level rise for over 15,000 years. In fact, if any of you ever go offshore and go fishing in the canyons off of here, marlin fishing in the Baltimore Canyon or the canyons that exist along the edge of the continental shelf, those are where rivers flowed over dry land and spilled into the ocean below it at the peak of the last ice age. So sea level has been rising, and in fact, We know that this peninsula has been completely covered by water in the past. When they were dualizing or creating Route 1 up near Smyrna, they were excavating material out to have a roadbed, and they found fossils of whales and sharks and lots of invertebrates that were indication that the sea has covered this peninsula. So in the very long term, over thousands and thousands of years, we've been seeing sea level rise, fall, rise back up, and it's going back to what it was once upon a time. And so we're dealing with that. We put communities that we don't expect to move on a movable landform. And that's, so fundamentally, that's a risk that we have accepted, that we expect our communities to be along the ocean coast, along the Delaware Bay coast, where things are kind of going on. The question right now is that what is going to happen with the rate of sea level rise? I find in media, especially, it's almost like sea level has just begun to rise. And really what the fundamental point is that sea level is rising and is likely to rise at a faster rate than we have experienced in the last few hundred years. The rate around here is a combination of the sea level rising, and then there's a little bit of settling of the state of Delaware. It's called isostatic rebound. I can explain that if you want, very simply put. But the land is subsiding a little bit. The sea level is rising, and so we have what's called a local rate. The local rate is about a foot per century, and we expect that to accelerate. And you know, I'm 72 years old, and I'm almost reaching that point where I've seen a foot of sea level rise. And that gets down to what are we starting to experience as a rate of, because of sea level rising. I had a chance to go down to dinner the other night in Ocean City, Maryland, in a restaurant that's called the Wine Bar. It's in the top of the Cambria Hotel right at the Route 50 Bridge. If you haven't been there, try it. It's really wonderful. As I'm going down, as a local knows, go down St. Louis Avenue, not Ocean Highway. Lo and behold, sunny day flooding. The roads are completely flooded. At every crossroad that went back to the inlet, to the bay there, they were all flooded up to Philadelphia Avenue. And I was going through at every intersection, I was going through almost a foot of water. That's pretty much unheard of. As a kid who spent the 1950s and 1960s in Ocean City, I don't remember that ever happening. Now it happens. Yes, we had northeast wind. Yes, we had a full moon, but there really was not a big storm out there. And so we're starting to see these flooding events happen more and more. Lewis has roads that flood pretty regularly on spring tides. And it's starting to see something. So we're starting to see those effects of the sea level increasing upon us. The jeopardy along our coastline, and my comments today are going to be very Rehoboth-centric, and maybe even looking at North Shores and Henlopen and Acres. It's kind of who we are today, but I know that some of you are representing other communities, so I'm also thinking about the dynamics along the rest of the ocean coast of the Delaware coastline. And what happens in Bethany, Moby more recently, and Dewey Beach, and South Bethany, and Fenwick. We see beaches by themselves retreat in a landward direction under sea level rise impacts, but also rise vertically. That's something that very naturally occurs. Waves will mound sand up, and it will keep pace, and has kept pace. But what we have done as a society is we have locked the elevation of the backside of all of our barrier beaches at the road elevation and the garage door opening and the steps into your house. We have now established that as the elevation that we want to maintain. When we have a coastal storm, 1962 nor'easter, sand was all over the barrier island, and that's how the barrier island would have raised itself over thousands of years. It rises up and it moves landward. And now we want to keep it from moving landward, and we want to keep it from vertically rising. So every time we have a storm, no matter where we are, not just in Delaware, also Maryland, I see it in Florida, I see it all over the place. We go back, we plow the sand off the road, we clear out the driveways, we keep our elevation fixed. And we'll catch up with this at some point. That's kind of a issue that's happening. One thing I've heard, we'll get into the storminess. I don't want to belabor these points, but it sort of sets the stage as to why we're here. Looking at the things that affect our quality of life and will affect our quality of life coming into the future decades. Storminess is something we talk a lot about, and the dynamics of the physics where we are, Mid-Atlantic states, is that we have a convergence or a boundary line typically throughout the winter. We have tropical, let me go back a step. We have tropical events that come out of the tropics, hurricanes, tropical storms. They are heat-dependent storms that take warm ocean water as a feeder mechanism, and they rise, the water, the heat rises up and they spin and they come up the coast and they die out as they head into colder waters. That's always going to be a problem, and it may become a bigger problem as our waters and oceans warm. The other thing is we have is what are called extratropical cyclones, which to a meteorologist would say it's a cold core. You do not have that warm central core that a tropical event has. And the cold core storms, the nor'easters that are the more devastating for us typically and historically, are starting. They used to form early in my career at DNREC in the 1980s. We could almost count on all the nor'easters starting around Hatteras and then blasting us badly. My observation over the last maybe 10 to 12 years is that that occurrence of that storm forming and having cold air from the north and warm air from the south that converge and start to mix together and rotate is happening more frequently right off of us or slightly to the north. And we're being spared the full effects of these northeasters. That might be a good thing. That might be, if that continues. And is that a weather anomaly or is that a climate change? We don't know yet. Time will tell. The other part of storminess, which is very concerning, is the increase of torrential downpours. The storms that deliver multiple inches of rain in a short period of time. And then I'll pick on Rehoboth just for a second, or pick out Rehoboth just for a second. When we were enlarging the beaches under my watch many years ago, about 12 years ago now, we had stormwater outfalls that were short in length, and they were overtopped by sand that was pumped onto the beach and blocked off a couple of the stormwater pipes. These stormwater pipes go out into the ocean and are affected by wave energy, and one of the ends had been knocked off, and the pipe got dammed up. And we had bad combination of things. We had a downpour one summer night. We got 2 or 3 inches of rain, and around Playland, nothing could flow out, and everything flooded. There, I don't know, half a dozen to a dozen cars were completely destroyed by floodwater in parking garages. There were cars on the streets. Playland had water all over their amusement area. And it was because we did not maintain infrastructure. We didn't know to maintain that infrastructure, didn't realize what the problem was going to be. But it's got to be a little bit more proactive than it's been. So we're really here today to talk a little bit about, where I'm losing sight of my notes here. I ramble. Sorry about that. I'm going to catch myself back up here. Let's talk about what's at risk. What's at risk is, why are we all here? Why do we live at the coast? Some of us, found jobs here. I was lucky enough to have found a job here in the late 1970s originally. But most of us have chosen to live here because of the amenity that the coast offers. It could be the beach, the ocean, the bays, for any number of reasons. We love to go to the beach, and that's what brings everybody here. We could be here because our businesses are thriving because other people like to come to the beach. But when you get right down to it, the whole economy here, all of it is fundamentally rooted in a high-quality coastal experience. People retire here, people vacation here, people rent homes here, people have businesses here, because people flock to the coast. And if we don't protect those amenities, and I'm talking about not just the ocean coast and Rehoboth Bay, I'm talking about the lakes that were subject of today's discussion. We're going to hear speakers throughout the morning that are more knowledgeable than I am about most of these issues. You'll get into those a little bit. But the important factor is that the amenity, the reason we're here, is a value. And when we're at an individual level, making value-based decisions, basically what an economist does is looking at what is the worthiness of investing in protecting or enhancing or improving something. It's easy to say, well, my house flooded out once in the last 10 years, and it might flood out again in the next couple of years. I know I should probably lift it up, but that roof really needs a lot more work than the lifting the house does. So we delayed the lifting of the house. But that might be a far more devastating experience should it happen before the roof has a leak in it. We make those decisions. And so communities and state governments and federal governments are faced with the same issue every year. And remember that people are holding offices and making decisions about how to spend money based on the fact that they're in for maybe 2 years, maybe 4 years, maybe 6 years. And they want to deliver the goods back to the people who put them in office. So when you get to a community level, investment is very often made on the immediate need. So some of the less immediate things like, well, the beach is still okay, the water in Lake Comegys is okay enough, maybe we could get another few years. But if we don't get a better handle on looking at the fundamental amenities that increase the value here, then we suffer the consequence of possibly losing that value and seeing things turn to the worse. So I think I'm setting the stage here a little bit. I don't want to talk too much further. I know we've got a few minutes for questions. I think I rambled off, and I don't even know what I'm supposed to be talking about at this point from my own notes. But the value is based on the coastal experience that we should be investing, and we should be investing not only money, but our caring into those non-monetized elements that are very, very important, I think, to all of us. And when I say I've been monetizing, it's hard to put a value dollar on a recreational amenity. How much is it worth for somebody to go to the beach? And I think you can measure that. I know I've worked with economists over the years. I was actually an adjunct professor at the university and got in marine policy and was sat on a number of theses and dissertations for economic students. We try to put a value on the human experience. How much is invested? Think about the people who put up the traffic from Baltimore or Washington or Philadelphia or Wilmington to come down here every weekend, and maybe some of you do. It's worth that agonizing experience of getting to the beach and getting home because of the day at the beach, the day on the water, the day on the lake, whatever it might be. People are spending a lot of time and effort to get here. They're spending a lot of extra money to buy a house that is here at the coast rather than at Bridgeville. You take a house that's right here that might be worth $3.3 million and you move it over to Shaft Ox Corner in western Sussex County and park it, and now it's what it's worth. It's worth about $400,000. That's called proximity value. The proximity of living here is what we want to protect, and that's why we need to make the investments that we need to make. So this workshop today is going to help us focus on that. The people that are going to be speaking after me are going to give you very particular issues to talk about and think about, but I congratulate Sally on bringing SOLA3 back together again for the first time before a community and having this conversation be forwarded. And I guess we have a few minutes for questions if anybody has any questions. Please. Anybody has a question and brave enough to come up and get the microphone, please do so. Good for you, sir. The kick off the day.
All right. Thank you. I'm curious if you could identify 1, 2, or 3 significant infrastructure projects we ought to be focused on for risk mitigation in this area.
Sure. And that's easy for me. So bias admitted, I was the administrator of Shoreline and Waterway, so being in charge of beaches, I understand the value of beaches more than anything else. And we take the beaches for granted. I will say the very first item is that a high-quality beach is really the most important and fundamental thing. And we have them. Thank God we have them. And the Corps of Engineers are going to be coming back in this winter and renourishing, maintaining Rehoboth, Dewey, Bethany, South Bethany, and Fenwick, all of them, all 5 beaches, this year are going to be done at the same, probably under one contract. But we still are in a position that the funding for those sequences, it's every 3 years, our beaches and Delaware coast are supposed to be renourished and maintained by the Corps of Engineers. And so far, thank goodness, that has been the case. And I think that the fundamental thing is let's not lose sight of the fact that if the desire to fund that 3 years from now is gone at the state level because they have to match the federal money or the federal level, we are going to be in some trouble. I look at Rehoboth the last few days with the lack of recreational beach. I took pictures of the beach at Rehoboth Beach just before Memorial Day, right before it was nourished. I think that was 2007, 2006, something around there. That was the first time we nourished that beach on a Memorial Day weekend. I measured the distance from the edge of the boardwalk. There was no dune, but from the edge of the boardwalk to the high water line was 15 feet. That's how much dry recreational area there was for Rehoboth Beach Memorial Day weekend before nourishment occurred. And we've gotten very used to, but also complacent in maintaining that. The second issue, I think, is the water quality issue, because we're seeing bacterial contents go up. Steve's going to talk probably a little bit about this, I think, a little later on. We're seeing bacterial content comes out. It raises a flag. The press is all over it. So I think looking at those stormwater pipes in Rehoboth Beach and where stormwater goes is a very important component. And that is also bayside, because it's not only bacterial issues, but it's also nutrient issues on our bays, our Rehoboth bays, and our lakes. Sally is a champion of the fact that the stormwater pipes in Rehoboth Beach are contributing both sediment and pollutants to the bays, to the lakes, which are very unique for our area. So I think water quality and pollutants is the second on my list. And the third, I would say, would be really looking at the Back Bay flooding issue, looking at our communities that are going to see more and more flooding from Rehoboth Bay and Little Asplundh Bay, Indian River Bay, all around the inland bays. I think that would be my, beaches, water quality, and then the Back Bay flooding.
You touched on this, Tony, and I guess Steve will also as well, but I think there's now been 5 advisories in Rehoboth of bacteria in the water, and the explanation that's been given is not the one that I have a question about, which is we know how many stormwater drains flow into the ocean, flow into the lakes, and I mentioned earlier the pollutants that are generally found in our Delaware waterways and toxins. Do you think some of the bacteria that is going into the ocean is from these stormwater drains?
I think so, very definitely. I think there's no question about it. The ocean ones in particular, when we have, so think about this, when we have a long period of time that with no rain, we had that, and we've had very number of days and weeks at a time during the summer especially, and this goes back decades ago. I saw it when I was at DNREC. I'd like to go back to the 80s and 90s. You'd see the same kind of trend. I'm going to be ever so graphic in just a second, but we have a nice population of seagulls that feed off of pizza and french fries. We have any number of birds that would be processing that food and putting it right into the street on the sidewalks. We have people whose dogs come out and do their business, and if it's in the curb, it's fine. We have any number of critters, raccoons, foxes, that could be defecating within the drainage system. And that will build up. It's like how many days in a row? You might go 21 days with no rain, and 21 days of all possible sources of defecation on the land. And then you get that one flushing rain that comes out, and it all goes flushing down the toilet out into the ocean. And so if the tests are taken right around the same time, right after that happens, you're going to have some issues in the water. You could probably test in the afternoon or the next day and find out that it's not the same issue. But I think that, that's part of the, certainly, and Steve's more of an expert on this stuff than I am, but he can probably address it more. But I think that's really, it's got to be, and same thing on the you have the same problems going into your lakes around here. It's exactly the same thing, but those are contained bodies. They don't have any outflows of any appreciable amount, so you're stuck with a non-flushing body of water. Good morning.
First of all, I'm happy to see our house is in the white area, not the blue area.
Good investment.
Risk management makes me think of insurance. Insurance makes me think of floodplains around here. Can you talk a little bit about how the sea level rise and other things you've been talking about affect the established floodplains and building in those floodplains and what that means for this area?
Yeah, absolutely. So, good question. Everybody heard it. It's about the floodplains and flood mapping. So, I'll try to make this brief. It could be a whole 30-minute discussion, and I don't want to do that. But the Federal Emergency Management Agency is really the caretakers of the flood insurance program, and for the flood insurance program is a voluntary community-by-community program that a community has to subscribe to. The community here would be Rehoboth or Dewey or Sussex County. So we're all covered. Every one of the communities that govern where we live and where land use decisions are made are participants in the National Flood Insurance Program. And so 2 things that go with that. Number 1 goes with that is that the local governing body has to adopt floodplain ordinances that are in keeping with at least the standard that FEMA has set, and could exceed those standards if they want to. It goes to elevation above a mapped floodplain, and that's a key point I'll get back to in a second. It goes to the mapped floodplain, the kind of risk that's assumed for the living portion of the house. They only insure the living portion of your house, not the foundation, not the front yard, not the garage. It's the living portion. So there are elevation requirements. There's a number of requirements that I'm not going to get into, but key to that is the accuracy of the floodplain map that is generated. And FEMA has been ongoing forever remapping. Now, they have the entire United States to do, and the territories. They do Puerto Rico, they do the Virgin Islands. They're involved in remapping, so almost a constant remapping effort goes on, looking at, are there forces at risk? Can we take the sea level rise indicators and incorporate those and evolve our predictive equations, or do we just come back in 10 or 15 or 20 years and remap it and change the zone? So there is an effort at least being made to keep things up to date with the best knowledge we have. you see a variety of predictions as to the rate of what I always refer to as local sea level rise rates. And it is still very much predictive. There are very good models that do that. But I always say this, when you have a model that will predict what a physical outcome will be based on a stressor in the environment, all you have to do to equate to how the accuracies are, look at the meteorological models that try to predict out 7 days and how accurate are those. It is, the further out you get, the less reliable I think you can be on that. It's the best we have, but if you say this low pressure is going to come over, right over Delmarva next Wednesday, and you're saying that today, and it gets to Tuesday, well, no, it's going up through Pennsylvania and off through New Jersey, missed us by 100 miles. That was pretty accurate in the atmospheric stream. It means a lot of difference to us. So I think that's where we are with the modeling, but the modeling is getting better all the time. And so the maps are where it can be improved upon. Anybody else? Yes, somebody coming up from the back. Don't run, we're all here, we're not going anywhere.
Hi.
Good morning.
Good morning. So, there's a lot of filling in of the floodplain in Sussex County as new subdivisions are built, which to me is completely crazy. I come from a state where they don't allow building in the floodplain, and I'm just wondering how much, when you fill in that floodplain, those floodwaters are going to go elsewhere. So how much do you think is that impacting the configuration of the floodplain?
It's a very good question. I think everybody could hear you. So
Yeah.
it's a great question. So one individual house does not necessarily fall into this category. Well, when these subdivisions are applied for to the county, there is a requirement that they do a stormwater management plan. In fact, the division that I worked in within DNREC has the drainage section within it who oversees the flood hazard condition that occurs when you put in a lot of impervious surfaces, new yards, aggravated by irrigation sometimes and other components. But there is a requirement that you have a flood management plan for your community, that you look at where the flows are going to go. It's why you see the proliferation of flood ponds, stormwater ponds. And then there is a condition of not only the stormwater, managing the stormwater itself, but also the sediment that is borne by that stormwater, so it settles into these stormwater ponds rather than gets carried into the adjacent creeks and valleys. And there are supposedly in place good catch-alls for that and trying to improve upon, admittedly, issues that occurred for a number of years, and you've got to follow up.
Yeah, I do. Because I recently was involved with the subdivision that, a third of the houses were in the floodplain and 5 portions of the roads. And they're filling in the floodplain so that the floodwaters can't go into that portion of the floodplain. And to me, your answer didn't really address the fact that incoming floodwater can't go where it used to go, so it has to go someplace else.
Well, that's the plan that was set up, and whether it's effective or whether it works or not is probably a different question. And it's outside of my realm of expertise. I will readily admit I'm a coastal guy, but
Yeah.
I know that what's in place is supposed to be accounting for that additional flow of floodwater and conducting it to a floodwater pond, a stormwater pond.
Yeah, I'll
It's
just
just not-
say, I recognize it's not part of your expertise, but particularly if it's in a tidal creek, that when there's a big storm event and the water can't come into where it used to be in the floodplain, the new subdivision is not catching that water. That water is being pushed into somebody else's and endangering other neighbors.
So I'll say this only because he's sitting right here, and he's friends enough
Yeah.
that we have a DNREC representative here, Steve Smailer, who will be talking to you in a few minutes. Now, it's not within his bailiwick, but he can take your message individually. He can see you and get your concern and take it back to the stormwater folks in DNREC, and maybe they can take a look at it.
Yeah, that would be great. My name
Okay.
is Judy Rose Seibert.
You can thank me later, Steve. Yeah. Whew, pass out. It's nice to be retired, I tell you what. All right, anybody else? If not, Sally, I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you very much.
My name is Diane Hanson. I am the Secretary of the SOLA Board, and it is my pleasure at this time to introduce our next speaker, whose name is Jim Lee. He is a Community Resource Officer with the Division of Climate, Coastal, and Energy in the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control, more known as DNREC among us. He's a certified climate change professional through the Association of Climate Change Officers. In his daily work, he assists the division in promoting various programs, including clean energy, rebates, clean transportation, weatherization assistance program, the low to moderate income solar program, and the Energy Efficiency Investment Fund.
Thank you. How's everybody doing today? Come on. We can do better than that. Saturday morning, all the tourists are gone. Lots of space on the smaller beaches that we have. There's enough space for everybody. I'm Jim Lee. I'm the Community Resources Officer for the Division of Climate, Coastal, and Energy. Is it picking it up? Good. And I just want to talk a little bit about the Climate Action Plan. Who knows anything about the Climate Action Plan? A couple people, that's good. All right, so it won't be repetitive for most of you, so that'll be good. Climate change in Delaware. As we've heard, sea level rise, more frequent and intense storms, heavy precipitation and flooding. These are some of the things, the impacts of climate change that we're seeing in Delaware, along with increased temperatures. So those are the main things. So as we were developing our climate action plan, the main things that we wanted to do, we wanted to help the state meet its emissions reductions targets that Governor Carney has already said, which was 26% from 2005 levels by 2025. The second thing we wanted to do was to integrate emissions reduction strategies and things we were doing to reduce emissions along with the adaptation side, which we're doing a lot in adaptation things and we're doing a lot in emissions reduction, but we never really brought them together to see how to help them be more effective, actually. So that was the second thing. The third thing is to set a course for future actions on what we were going to do in the decades ahead. The important thing to remember about the climate plan is it's a living document. The strategies that are outlined in the plan, they build off of what we've been doing for some things for many decades, like the Sea Level Rise Advisory Committee that was started in 2012 or something. The strategies in the plan can be implemented over time as resources and data and partnerships develop. And as the science changes and as we get a different picture, depending on where we are and what we're doing, both here in Delaware and around the world. And that's interesting. Okay. Didn't realize this was a three-part slide. I thought they were all one-part slides, so I'm going to be surprised by some of these slides, I think, so bear with me, okay? All right, so in developing the plan, the first thing we did, as I said, we built off past efforts, the sea level rise, planning thing, Executive Order 41, other reviews, climate action that we had taken. Then we gathered information, we interviewed state agencies on things that they were doing and things they wanted to do. We talked to neighboring states and looked at that, and we looked at our greenhouse gas modeling that we are already doing. Finally, we engaged stakeholders. We held public workshops in every county to get public input on what they thought should be done. We also did online surveys. We had submission forms for comments. And then after that information, when we came back later, unfortunately, there was a pandemic or something, and the live meetings were put off on everything, so we did virtual meetings, but we did a series of virtual meetings as well to get additional feedback from people. So let's talk first about maximizing resilience. When we talk about resilience, who knows what's the definition of that? Resilience is your ability to bounce back after a major event. Okay, and how you can deal with that. So what we learned in developing the plan, we interviewed staff from 10 different agencies. These agencies are already working on things that are designed to increase and improve resiliency, and they want to expand on that, and they want to do more. Our workshop attendees, people, the stakeholders, general public, thought that regulatory actions and community and stakeholder support were some of the major things that we should be looking at. Okay, so we took that information and we came up with strategies to maximize resilience. The first strategy is updated or new state regulations. Now, we've talked about plans, management plans, different things. Regulations, a lot of the regulations that are in place in the state were developed a long time ago. Now, they undergo annual reviews or 5-year reviews or 10-year reviews and things, but are we incorporating what we know about climate change when we are updating these plans? This is something that we need to be doing. And we also want to develop a comprehensive strategy to conserve and restore our ecosystems. The next area is support for communities and stakeholders. And you'll notice the resilience actions are focused on state agencies. The state agencies in the state plays a big role in helping communities and helping local governments build their resilience efforts. So these are focused mainly on state agencies. So what can the state do? The state can increase grant opportunities for adaptation projects, prioritize funding for projects. It can assist local governments, homeowners, and industries in increasing resilience. It can support the programs and initiatives that help frontline communities. So these are some of the things that we can do. It can also provide training, tools, and technical assistance. The next area, which I mentioned, was management plans. Communities have management plans on how they are going to deal with growth and different issues and things. So incorporating climate change impacts and adaptation into their strategic plans can help as they move forward. It can also incorporating that into emergency response, hazard reduction plans, and update or create management plans that incorporate future climate projections. Another area to improve resilience is in facility design and operation. The state owns more than 100 different facilities and places and does a lot of different land and different things. So, okay, what is the state doing? Are they operating their facilities? Are they considering climate change when they are moving them or building them? What are they doing, and how are they incorporating climate change into that? The next area is research and monitoring. We do a lot. I mean, there's a lot of national research, there's a lot of international research, and there's some Delaware research, and it all plays a part in creating the picture for us on what climate change is doing here and what it will be doing. So we need to continue to expand our research here in Delaware on what we're doing and increase the number of pilot projects and things that we're doing so we can see what's working and where we should be investing for the future. We also want to continue to enhance and improve our outreach and education. I asked you at the beginning, who knows about the climate plan? The governor released the climate plan in November 2021. It's almost November 2022. The fact that a lot of you haven't heard or don't know a lot about the climate plan, that's on us. We need to do a better job getting out there, developing communication tools, increasing the availability of education programs. We need to do better at that, so that's going to be a focus as well. And then agency support. The government agencies need to be supporting local governments. They need to be a leader. They need to be transitioning their fleets to electric vehicles and working on different things. So improving the information sharing on what one state agency is doing. Is that working? Is that helping? And working together for a greater results. I'll back up. So those are the resiliency side things that are included in the plan. And remember, the climate plan itself does not mandate anything. It does not regulate anything. It does not tell us that we have to, it does not say you have to do this. What it does is say, here are things that you can do. And if you do these things, then we can move, it'll be ways for us to move forward. It's not that our secretary, Sean Garvin, likes to say it's a GPS. It tells us here is a path to better resilience or better emissions reduction. What we choose to do, what our state government chooses to do, what your elected leaders choose to do, is that's to be debated and that's to be found out later. The plan merely outlines things that we can do. So let's look at minimizing emissions. And this is a cool part because in the minimizing emissions, I work for the Division of Climate, Coastal, and Energy, and we are already doing a lot of cool things. We have rebates for electric vehicles. We have our weatherization assistance program, which helps homes become more energy efficient. We have our green energy program, which provides grants for solar programs and things. So these are things that we are already doing and things that help minimize emissions. So this portion hits home pretty close. So our emissions, we know that human activities have increased the amount of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, okay? The top 3 sectors for emissions in Delaware are transportation, industrial, and electric power. And transportation is the biggest. So what we learned when we were looking at minimizing emissions, if we don't do anything new, if we don't take any additional actions, we won't hit that 2025 goal. We'll just miss it, just a little bit. If we use some of the modeled actions, we can hit that goal. The more we do, the more we can exceed that 2025 target with a potential of up to 31% reduction in 2025. Now we know, the other thing we know is while we're going to just miss the target now, emissions are going down now, but they're going to go up. And by, I think one of the slides coming up says it's like 2035 or so, emissions will start going up because the population is continuing to grow. So strategies to minimize emissions. One of the strategies is investing in clean and renewable energy, which we are doing. I mentioned the green energy program, which helps with solar installations. We can increase that. We can improve that on that. We can do more with that. We also need to address the equity challenges that in access to these types of things. And as I'll mention later, we just recently launched a low to moderate income solar project, which we're trying out now, and hopefully we'll be able to expand it. Right now it's for Delmarva Power customers. Hopefully we want to expand it statewide to help low to moderate income families install solar, improve their energy bills. We want to ensure that Delaware is prepared for offshore wind. There's a lot of talk of offshore wind. No decisions have been made on that yet, but they're moving forward and they're looking, and the governor has said, we want to be at the table and we want to make sure we're there. And we want to make sure that our state agencies are increasing their commitment to renewable energy as well. We also want to look at energy efficiency measures. These can be put in place pretty quickly, actually. Our building energy codes, which we updated a couple years ago now, and I think we're starting the process to update them again as new technology and new information becomes available. expand our energy efficiency programs for residential and commercial buildings. The low to moderate income program I mentioned, improve our industrial energy efficiency, and one of the ways we help that is through our Energy Efficiency Investment Fund, which helps businesses become more energy efficient and also saving on their bottom line too. And that goes for all of you. When you're making your home more energy efficient, you're using less, you're reducing emissions, but you know what? You're saving money too. So it makes sense. Then we come to transportation, which I mentioned was the biggest contributor to emissions in Delaware right now. We want to continue to grow and strengthen the adoption of electric vehicles in the state. We have a rebate program for electric vehicles that's in place. We want to expand the charging infrastructure for electric vehicles, and we're doing that on two different fronts right now. DelDOT is working on a federal program, which I'll talk about in a second, and we're also working with DelDOT on a statewide EV infrastructure plan. We want to also improve efficiency of freight delivery, reduce vehicle miles traveled. If some of you are still working from home on several days, you're reducing your vehicle miles traveled, so that's a cool thing. Ensure electric and hybrid plug-in vehicles contribute to grid stability. Capitalizing on transition to zero-emission vehicles. And we think, again, here, we think the state can lead by example and be a leader in this transition. Another area that's addressed in the Climate Action Plan is high global warming potential greenhouse gases. Different greenhouse gases stay in the atmosphere longer or are more potent than CO2. Delaware's focus is on hydrofluorocarbons and methane, and we're trying to reduce emissions from those. With hydrofluorocarbons, which is basically refrigerants used in refrigerants, we're trying to get companies to use different things that are less harmful to the environment. With methane, we're looking at leakage from pipelines and trying to get, reducing that is going to help. And we can also reduce methane by diverting waste from landfills, which is a source, through increased recycling, which a lot of people are doing now. Another area addressed in the plan is offsetting carbon emissions through natural working lands. Our forests, our swamp lands, our marshes have the ability to sequester carbon, and we want to make sure that we're supporting, conserving, and restoring forests and these natural working lands. So, what are we doing? What progress are we making? As I said in the beginning, the plan, the Climate Action Plan, builds off of what we have been doing for decades. It brings together a lot of the things that we have been doing, puts it all together uniform. But there are some things that we have done since November when the governor announced the Climate Action Plan. One of those is the Tree for Every Delawarean initiative. We aim to plant 1 million trees, and there's a brochure over on the table if you can pick one of those up on your way out. You can help because we have a Teddy tracker, DE.gov/Teddy. Go on there, you can put information. If you plant trees on your property, you go in there, you put in the information, how many trees you planted, what they were. You can put pictures of your trees there, and then you can be part of the solution and say, look, I'm on the Teddy tracker. That's cool. I should have looked it up to see how many. I think it's around 200 or maybe 300,000. But that's probably way off, and I'm probably missing it. So go look it up yourself. We also started the Delaware Climate Leadership Academy. Training in the curriculum focuses on learning climate change's impacts and what they do, and how to prepare for the challenges, risk assessment, dealing with different aspects of climate change that can come up. There are modules that are more nationally or world-oriented on climate change, but then there are Delaware-specific classes, too, that go over specific things. The inaugural class, there were like, I think, 60 different participants from a dozen state agencies, I want to say 30 or 40 state agencies, which is what it was limited to on the inaugural class. The second class that we're doing is open, which enrollment is open now, and you can go to de.gov/Climate Academy. And people who work in institutions of higher learning, people who work in sustainability fields, representatives of some nonprofits would be eligible to participate. It's a very intensive course. It's like 40 hours, and there's a lot of work to it, but you learn a lot going through it. We also last fall instituted a grant program for DC fast chargers to help with the infrastructure, EV infrastructure, and we dedicated $1.4 million, which will go to help those who win the award, the bids, to encourage them to put in fast charging stations. We expect to be awarding those grants hopefully in the next few weeks. As I said, we started our low to moderate income solar program. It's a 2-year pilot program. Right now it's limited to Delmarva Power. We want to expand it, grow it statewide, and help more people. And you can visit that with de.gov/LMI. I mentioned also that we were working on EV infrastructure, and DelDOT recently submitted to the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program a plan to install EV chargers along highways and different things. It's part of $15 million in federal dollars to Delaware over a 5-year period, and hopefully the government will accept that plan and it will be able to move forward. At the same time, DelDOT is working with DNREC to come up with a statewide EV infrastructure plan. So, next steps. We're continuing to work on that. We're continuing to do things to try to help reduce our emissions, to try to help improve our resiliency. The guiding principles for implementation of the Climate Action Plan, which we've had since the beginning, are to ensure climate action is ambitious but adaptable. I mean, as things change and as we learn more, we need to be able to change and adapt to that. We want to make sure that climate action accounts for all costs and all benefits. A lot of times when you hear about different actions, building a seawall or whatever, well, that's going to cost a lot, you know. Well, there's going to be benefits from that. We want to make sure that the costs and the benefits are taken into consideration. And we want to ensure that climate action is engaged, empowering, and equitable. We relied heavily on technical experts, on community meetings, on group meetings, on public participation and input in developing the plan, and that's going to continue as we move forward. So, winding up, I just encourage you to stay informed. You can go to de.gov/climate plan and get all of this information. You can see another presentation that we did last November. It's on video. It's available in English and Spanish. The climate plan is there. Copies of it are available in English and Spanish. The website itself goes over resiliency, emissions, climate action, things that we're doing, everything. So keep up to date on what we're doing with that. Connect with us on social media, and you'll find out about anything else that's coming up or that we're doing as well. And that's the quick summary of the Delaware Climate Action Plan. So, do you have questions? Well, I'm sorry, I'm not taking it.
So a lot of what you said gives rise to lots of questions, a lot of questions. Electric vehicles won't insure the grid. They won't support the grid, and the grid won't support them. I'm assuming DNREC doesn't have electric power generation capabilities. The state of Maryland just put through an increase of 9% over 3 years for electric grid reconstruction and computerization of the grids. I don't want to see brownouts happen around here. You know, I just don't think it's the benefit wouldn't outweigh the advantage. So one of the things that really bothers me is driving down Old Landing Road, Route 24, and New Road, and you talk about trees. I got to believe that 500,000 trees have been taken down over the last 6 months in just those roads alone. So the question really, and you didn't address it, is what influence does DNREC and your department have with respect to the building? Why aren't the builders planting trees? Why do we have to be planting trees, right? And what regulations for, you know, clear cutting all of these trees, especially from the Old Landing Road site. All the animals have been displaced, everything has been displaced from all the clear cutting, not to mention the absorption and the water in the land itself. So I wonder if you could address that.
Well, actually, I think you answered the question yourself when you said, what does my division do? And our division has nothing to do with regulations on land development and such. So actually, probably you want to start at the county level on that. If Sussex County is saying, yeah, go ahead, developers, you can do that. Yeah, well, that's, I mean, but again, and this is why, actually, if you look in what I went over in the plan, with management plans and things, these are things that, you know, communities should be adopting and should be looking at and considering the climate action, the climate impacts that are occurring and how things that we can do to reduce that. So these are things that should be done. As I said, the climate plan itself does not, it doesn't mandate anything. It doesn't do anything. That's up to the local governments, state government, your elected leaders to put those things into law. So, I mean, being active and saying, hey, we don't want 50 acres of trees cut down for no reason, that's where you start with that. But the Division of Climate, Coastal, and Energy, all we did is say, here are some of the things that you can do, but we don't have any jurisdiction over local land issues. Sorry.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm a Rehoboth Beach City Commissioner and chair of the Environment Committee, and we have a tree code in Rehoboth. Sussex County needs one. My question is, we're in the early stages of developing our own climate action plan, and within the state's climate action plan, it says that there is funding to help municipalities I think, develop and implement some of the climate action plans. It's very vague. Can you speak to that at all?
No. However, what I will do, because I'm not the one who's handing out money and stuff and coming up with programs and things, and I wouldn't be like, yeah, sure, we'll give you $5 million, don't worry about it. Because some of my boss would be like, you did what? But here's my card, please take it. Shoot me an email, and I will connect you with the people who can get you the answer for that.
Yes, also, thank you for your presentation. And you said about strengthening building energy codes. That's, I guess, statewide. Is there anything that you can do to help it filter down to Sussex County level? Because, you know, the county building, it's county building codes that are important.
Yeah, I'm not the expert in that area either, as far as how the different municipalities create their own codes and things, or what they do. But again, excuse me, going to your local government and
Yeah.
saying, the state has these codes.
Okay, and second question, let's see, how was I going to phrase this? Oh, so since this is a new climate plan, has DNREC done any presentation to the Sussex County Council and to Planning and Zoning? Because that would be helpful. One of the council members told me that basically he can never mention climate change in a meeting because they all poo-poo it. So I think a lot of and I think it's incumbent upon DNREC to do some education for the county council and planning and zoning.
We
So-
would love to go talk to them, but they would have to, I mean, we can't say we're going to come do a presentation.
No, but can you offer?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
and have you offered? And if you haven't,
I'm not
do.
sure.
Yeah, please
I
do.
mean, we have done some outreach, but I don't
Yeah.
know specifically, but yeah, okay.
Yeah.
That's a
Okay,
good
thank
idea.
you. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Bunky Markert, and I'm a soon-to-be city commissioner with City of Rehoboth Beach. A couple of things. I would certainly think that this is an opportunity for a two-way conversation between representatives of the state and the local community and city in particular. As my colleague here, Ed, mentioned, you know, we have a tree ordinance here, and it's something that we've had for a long time, and we attempt to protect trees, which in your presentation with regard to, you know, not only is it carbon capture, it's an asset to the community that we have trees and so forth and so on. And I guess my message to you would have to do with, you know, we are a city, we are not a county, we are not a state, and we can certainly benefit from the guidance and the impact that the other governmental units can provide. And I would say, unfortunately, live in a county that is very pro-development and really doesn't, I think, advocate for environmental issues in over maybe the business concerns. Excuse me. So anyway, one thing I just want to comment on with regard to trees, which I think we feel strongly about, I certainly do, that there's always been this situation where when we do, let's say, large projects, we created an outfall project a couple years ago where there was a lot of interest in doing underground, having underground utilities and so forth, installed during that process, or at least in certain areas where those kind of projects take place. And that never really sort of got off the ground, simply because I think there's a lot of blowback from the utility companies or whatever. And as a city, we really don't have a lot of muscle to be able to try to insist on that. And I was curious if there was anything, let's say, in these climate programs and policy that would possibly strengthen that, where under certain circumstances things would be done to sort of benefit trees, especially in an urban environment. Okay, and thank you.
Yeah, and just to reiterate, go back, the Climate Leadership Academy, the second class is starting at the end of October or November. That's open now for registration. I would encourage you or somebody from from the city to go take that class and learn about I think it would provide a lot of the information that you're looking for and insights. Anyone else? If not, I appreciate you listening to me drone on here for a while. I hope you learned at least one web address that you can go visit and maybe check out some other things that we're doing. And thank you all for your time.
Hi, my name is Jan Conacy, and I'm a board member of SOLA. And it is, that must have been my husband. Anyway, my job today, among other things, is to introduce Danielle Swallow. Danielle is a coastal hazard specialist with the Delaware Sea Grant program at the University of Delaware, where she provides technical assistance and outreach to communities on emergency preparedness and building resilience to weather and climate hazards. I just have to add, having our home destroyed 2 years ago by a tornado in Dover, Delaware, where we don't have tornadoes, we're really interested in this topic. She is the co-founder of the Resilient and Sustainable Communities League, a professional network of organizations dedicated to helping communities thrive in the face of changing climate and environmental conditions. Yes. She is also active advising communities about resilient land use practices, hazard mitigation strategies, and capacity building. Danielle is also the 2022 recipient of the Mid-Atlantic Sea Grant Award for Outstanding Outreach. She has over 20 years' experience in climate, marine policy, and planning. So Danielle, thank you.
Yes, I'm going to be talking about some of the factors that influence our vulnerability to weather and climate change here in our region here near Rehoboth. And I think Tony did a fantastic job of teeing up a lot of this topic for us today. And I'll try to not cover some of the same material, but maybe expand on some parts of it, and then try to also get to some of the questions that we heard. And it's kind of counterintuitive, but I'm going to start out at our water workshop talking about the lack of water, that we're currently in a drought here, the severity of which is most significant right here in the Lewis and Rehoboth area. And even with the rain earlier this week, I don't think it's done enough to really address that. And this is part of a natural fluctuation in our climate being sort of the long-term average of weather over weeks and months and seasons and years. And of course, in the western half of the U.S., right, drought has been far more persistent and severe. And we know that there's a definite human influence there with global warming that has really magnified the extent of the drought. But I think for our region, on the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast, we tend to experience climate change more from the wet side. That's what we're seeing is impacts on the wet side, including precipitation. So Delaware has had 3.6 inches of rain, an increase in that over the years from 1895 on. And we expect more increase in rainfall percentages over time, but particularly in the intensity of rainfall. And why that's important for us to note, of course, is that when you have a greater amount of rain falling over shorter duration, it could potentially overwhelm stormwater drains and stormwater management systems, particularly if they're not designed for that greater intensity. And so we could experience more runoff into our lakes and our, in the ocean and neighborhoods, and ponding on our streets, and the velocity of runoff, would be greater. And that could also have a bearing on the water quality. There's less time and, for that water to filter out some sediments and contamination. This is a graphic that I pulled off of a great new tool that just came out this week from the federal government that this is specific for Rehoboth. It's looking at the annual days with total precipitation over 1 inch throughout the rest of the century, based on 2 different scenarios of global greenhouse gas emissions. We kind of look at different scenarios for emissions because it does influence the rate of climate change, the rate of global warming. So lower emissions slows the rate higher emissions accelerates that rate. But you can see that in the Rehoboth area, it's projected that we experience up to 9 more days of intense rain over 1 inch. That could be falling within, a period of hours, or it could fall within a period of 1 hour, and trying to model that and plan for that is important, because again, can our stormwater infrastructure handle it? Tony talked about sea level rise a bit. Of course, we know that it appears as an increase in the average height of our tide over time. So our high tides are getting higher, our low tides are getting higher. And so in terms of our wetlands, which provide such an amazing function in our communities, the storage capacity of those wetlands is being reduced by virtue that the tides are just inundating them more naturally, and through the influence of climate change. And I think that over time, sea level rise becomes sort of the agitator of, or kind of exacerbates flooding that we could experience from our various storminess events, whether it be just heavy precipitation or coastal storms that blow in wind and storm surge. That storm surge would be on top of the additionally high tide to begin with. The government put out a new set of climate sea level rise scenarios this year, and I'm happy with what they've done. I've been talking to experts within the university to really assess the strength of these scenarios, and we think they're good. Essentially, we have a long record of observations now in our country, including at the Lewis tide gauge, a phenomenal record there, which is very helpful for Rehoboth on the Atlantic side. And we know that through observations and the extrapolation of those observations 30 years out, that aligns really well with what the models tell us. And for the first time, there's high confidence that we know what the rate of sea level rise will be by 2050. Essentially, as measured by the Lewis tide gauge, we've seen between 14 and 16 inches of sea level rise since, I think, 1920. And essentially now we're going to repeat that increase. Instead of it taking a century, it's going to take 30 years. So we're going to see up to another 1.5 feet of sea level rise in this area. Now, that might be kind of disconcerting, but knowledge is power. And we have high confidence in this projection. As we go further out beyond 2050, and as Tony said, it gets harder to model that precisely. There's different factors in play, including what happens with the ice sheets in Greenland and so forth. The dynamics that are at play are being actively researched now, and we have new understanding all the time. But there's confidence levels and probabilities associated with projections as you go beyond that, and they're still helpful to plan within. You just have to kind of know what you're working with. But the point I want to leave you with is that, here in this region, we're going to see increasing rates of flooding, and as Noah's saying, potentially it's going to go from minor flooding to moderate flooding. So on sunny days, as Tony mentioned, we might see ponding on low-lying roads and property. We're going to see that potentially with more frequency. And then as storms blow in, we have a storm, if a storm's sitting offshore over successive tide cycles, we're going to see additionally a lot more flooding and more impacts. Across the U.S., has seen a greater frequency and intensity of disasters. These are your natural disasters like your wildfires and drought and your hurricanes and even like your snowstorms and blizzards. But notice that can you see that okay? Notice that the number of events that are reaching billion-dollar level. And by the way, this is consumer price index adjusted, so it's inflation adjusted. And you're seeing the number increase over time, and this graphic shows 2022 up through June. Certainly the drought will be one of the factors for this year. But the trend line, the average, is the black line. And so you can see that, recent events, recent years, We're well above that. Why am I showing this? Well, because there's consensus among the world's climate change experts that human-induced climate change is affecting many weather and climate extremes in every region across the globe. And why is that? You know, because climate kind of exacerbates some of these weather events. You know, you have more moisture going into the atmosphere because of hotter temperatures, for example, and that can lend to, you know, more rainfall dumping, for example. There's also another factor. So looking at this graphic, we know that probably the frequency and intensity of disasters is being impacted partially by global warming, human-induced climate change. But there's another factor at play too, and that's population change. Looking at this map of the states with the highest increases are in red, I think it's pretty interesting. If you think about some of these states that are red, Texas, for example, the site of many a hurricane, the site of lots of drought, right? Some of these western states, Washington and Oregon, you know, they've had quite a lot of wildfires, for example. And that also happens to be where there's population growth, right? Really out, you know, kind of going out of control. Florida is certainly known as a hurricane magnet. So you have more people that are moving into the path of the hazard. They are increasing their exposure to the hazard. As they build out communities, there's more infrastructure in that path. There's more exposure of infrastructure to the hazard. Notice too on this map that Delaware is colored red. Okay, so Delaware's got explosive population growth. We know that here because we could just look outside, right? And I think I looked up, based on the 2020 census, since 1960, Sussex County has had over 200% increase in population. And who's moving to Delaware? Folks that are retiring, right? Folks over age of 60, 65. This shows a kind of this is for statewide, but this shows a state of Delaware age distribution, starting with 1960 in the upper left corner. You saw more of a pyramid kind of shape there. And over time, we fattened out, and our aging population has increased significantly. And the reason I like to call this out is because as the pandemic showed us, a different form of disaster, that certain groups are disproportionately impacted compared to others. Older adults are one of those groups. There's others as well, right? Our low-income families and our black and brown communities and so forth. But I just want to call out older adults because I think that's particularly relevant here in this neck of the woods. Why are they impacted? Well, yeah, potentially there's health concerns, right? That could make them more vulnerable even to weather impacts. But let's also think about the fact that a lot of older adults are no longer in the workforce. So if their house is destroyed by a flood or a tornado and they're displaced, it might take longer for them to kind of get back into the swing of things and relocate. A lot of older adults that I encounter here have family members that don't live in this state. They live elsewhere. So if there's an evacuation, you're cut off, the power's cut off, you know, who are you getting in touch with? Can they rely on other neighbors? You know, that's a big compelling issue for us. And then, you know, there's mobility factors and other things like that to think about. So I know we live in a fairly affluent area, but there's also real pockets of poverty. There's people on fixed incomes, and there's people whose equity is sitting in their house. And even with flood insurance, that only covers about $250,000 worth of the containment of the items in the house. So I think frankly we're cooking a recipe for disaster in Delaware. I'm just going to say it because I think that we're increasing our exposure. We know the hazard is kind of increasing because of climate change. You know, there's a little bit more amped up weather coming. And we have, maybe the question for all of us is, do we have the policies and plans and the mechanisms in place to address that? Land use patterns. One of the ways that we can reduce vulnerability is how we build our communities and how we design them. Here at the coast, we see record levels of construction, in terms of the number of building permits that are being issued. Sussex County ranks 3rd among all coastal counties in the US, according to one study. And how they're being designed. So I want to just mention earlier, a question was about, why doesn't the state pass land use regulations? Because the answer is we're a home rule state. As a home rule state, all the land use decisions are delegated down to the local and county level. Interestingly, I was really shocked to hear this. 3/4 of our county lives in unincorporated parts. So 3/4 of the population in Sussex County has to follow the county's regulations for land use decisions and so forth. Oops, getting ahead. Whoops. So it's really incumbent on our municipalities and our county to pass land use ordinances and building codes that help to improve resilience by reducing vulnerability. If we're going to build in these places, then we need to take extra steps to reduce vulnerability. Now, Steve can correct me, but I don't believe the state's stormwater and sediment management regulations actually automatically factor in climate change. So when the developers come in and they're planning subdivisions, they're not required to think about sea level rise, the water table rising, the added increase in precipitation intensity. And that doesn't mean they can't go to higher standards. But it's up to the public to hold them to task, right? Because if it's not in the land use code, if it's not in the state regulations, then there has to be other incentives for best practices to be followed. And we do need more best practices here because we have, again, increasing exposure and increasing vulnerability and a hazard that's kind of getting amped up by climate change. So building community resilience requires a forward-looking approach. It is the ability to bounce back. What it means is that we may not be able to avoid disruptions from flooding or from tornadoes and things like that. But what we could do is reduce the magnitude of that disruption, reduce the severity of it, and reduce the duration that people are disrupted. And we can do that through the kinds of smart policies and plans that we put in place, for example. So I'm just going to leave you with a few thoughts about some broader strategies of how to do that. And I think it's relevant to Rehoboth and the lakes management. I think it's relevant to our coastal management, which is that we ought to plan to higher standards. So think of our state regs and even our county regs as guidelines, minimum standards, minimum. But we need to take extra steps, be above and beyond that, to really ensure our resilience in the future. We should start, and I think this is being done through your comp plan, but you're factoring climate change into the comp plan, thinking about future conditions, not just what today's conditions are, but also making sure that's integrated into our building codes, for example, our emergency management plans, making sure all demographics are thought about in these plans and how they're going to be impacted. And, this could be tricky, but avoid building in the floodplain, right? The state has issued guidance to state agencies telling them to avoid building state facilities in the floodplain. They just can't prescribe that to the state and county, to the local and county levels. And here in Rehoboth, I know it's mostly built out, right? There's a lot of redevelopment, but there's still opportunities to think about where can we convert highly vulnerable floodplain area perhaps to open space. It's a tough issue though, right? Because that does impact people and property holders. But there's co-benefits that could also be generated, if we do that. And if we can't avoid building in the floodplain, then we should be incorporating green infrastructure as much as possible. There was a question earlier about floodplain management. And I think that the answer is that a natural floodplain, serves many purposes. And it does a terrific job of conveying water from one part to another and maintaining sediment structure and bank structure and providing habitat, for all kinds of wildlife and providing aesthetics to our community, and water quality benefits. And the more that we pave over our floodplain and we alter our floodplain, using regulations that perhaps don't always incorporate the latest science, then we're altering those natural beneficial functions. We may not necessarily be able to duplicate the functions to a T. Green infrastructure is basically saying that nature is nature's best defense against Mother Nature. It's like nature does the job if we allow it to. So putting in bioswales, that can capture and filter water along our streetscapes, encouraging the vegetation of buffers, which I believe Save Our Lakes does that already, encouraging ample buffers, wider than than we have in place. Those things are important. And then retrofitting our existing infrastructure to make sure that we're factoring in these increasing rates of precipitation, for example, sea level rise. I wanted to mention that this just is hot off the press, is that DelDOT's hosting a public meeting coming up on September 20th at 5 and then at 6. It's the same meeting, just at 2 different times, because they've been doing a study of Route 1 between Dewey and Fenwick Island to look at how to elevate it or improve the resiliency of this really critical evacuation route. And I'm fascinated to see what the study and the modeled results will tell us. But this is a public meeting. They're looking for your input, and they're looking to brief out some of that work that was done by AECOM. So I have the link here, but you can also go to DelDOT to look that up. And I hope you'll take advantage of that. Another kind of overarching recommendation is that I think as a community at large, we need to invest more in community preparedness, response, and recovery now before there is a disaster in place. And I think that starts with hiring climate adaptation and hazard mitigation professionals in our municipal governments and in our county governments. Having a resiliency officer, because this stuff isn't going away. And our town officials are often super busy, dealing with all kinds of matters. Someone who's dedicated to this topic and can work with different state and federal officials, help apply for grants. There is money out there. That was another question. There is money out there. DNREC has a Resilient Community Partnership Program. There's all kinds of money. DEMA right now is swimming in money, and they don't have enough projects to spend it on. So communities have an opportunity right now to apply for pre-disaster mitigation funding called BRIC, and there's other acronyms too. The other thing is that I think it's really important that we expand and support the development of social networks. We have them, in many places, but we need to grow them further and realize that these networks play a role in disasters as well. I'm privileged to be part of a group called the Cape Community Coalition. It was known as CCC for COVID, and it stood up right after the shutdown of from the pandemic by just local community folks in Lewis. Basically, it covers the Cape Henlopen School District, but we flex out beyond that. And that group just went to task trying to figure out what are the needs. This major disaster is unfolding. What are the needs? And they got to work, realizing that there were, initially it was a need for PPE equipment, but then over time they saw that the lines at the food distribution sites were growing, and the suppliers were running out of food. So they basically just went to the network and said, who in our network could help? And surprisingly, there were groups that said, we have extra food, and there's groups here that had extra warehouse space, and they were able to work and coordinate together and do a lot more using the same, leveraging resources, existing resources better. They also worked to get vaccinations of the most, of the most vulnerable folks in our community, folks who didn't have access to an internet to sign up for the vaccination drives, who maybe didn't have a lot of mobility or transportation to get to these sites. So they worked on that, actually, repurposing a bookmobile to serve as a mobile vaccination unit, for example. And I think that what it taught us is that there are pervasive, existing, social needs in the community that are here all the time, there's a housing crisis with affordable housing, there's homelessness on the rise, a lot of food insecurity. And these social needs, they will prevent the community from rebounding if there's another disaster placed upon them. So again, that duration of the disaster, the magnitude of the disaster will be even more so because there's already a lot of vulnerability within the community. So if we work to shore up and reduce some of that vulnerability now, we can improve our ability to bounce back. And then finally, I think that, just speaks to the need to carry out disaster preparedness training. Maybe leveraging some of these networks, working with our business community, on Main Street in Rehoboth. How many of them have done continuity planning, right? So, we need to involve all sectors in that and begin now. And then I'm ending with that it's National Preparedness Month. So it's perfect timing. This is the statistical peak of hurricane season today, I think. But it's perfect timing to, you've already shown great interest in being here, and you've taken the time out of your day to be here. But I just implore you to take another, hour of your day this weekend or this week and do one thing that improves your preparedness. You can visit ready.gov for lots of examples of emergency supply kits, or how to create a household communications plan. So if you're cut off, with the internet or cell phone towers are down, you have sort of a plan in place to know where to meet up with your family members, or how to get a hold of family members that are out of state. And you could sign up for emergency management notification systems. Delaware has the emergency notification system called DENS. If you have a landline, you're automatically enrolled, but if you have a cell phone, you need to register it. Simple, really easy. Just go to that website. And then Smart 911, I think, is golden. This is not so much a system that's pushing out information. This is actually aiding emergency responders if they need to call on your house. So if the fire and rescue truck is headed to your house and a screen pulls up with your address, if you've created a profile on here, you're able to populate that profile to also tell them how many members are in your household. Whether members of the household have maybe are hard of hearing, have diabetes or epilepsy or allergies, useful information for them to work with. Whether you have pets, how many, are any, not particularly friendly to strangers. What access points are helpful for them to know about. What are your cars and what are your license plates? You can put all that information in and gives them more information to work with, because during an emergency, seconds matter. So this is available in every state in the US. So if you have family members out of state, maybe an elderly parent, you can sign them up. You can actually create a profile for them. So I really encourage you to do that. I'm on a personal push to do this. And Sussex County's Joe Thomas, the emergency management official, is really hot on this one too. So I'm going to stop here, but I hope I've got you thinking, and I'm happy to take any questions.
First off, thank you very much for your presentation. Very good. I don't know if you're the right person to answer this. I understand that Delaware is a home rule state, but is there any effort on the part of the state to pull back some of the plenary powers from the county jurisdictions in the area of floodplain regulation and reforestation, which in my state, where my other house is Maryland, they have both of those. So you may not be the right person to answer that, or maybe someone else is, but it seems to me that the state of Delaware really needs to have at least those powers to require the other jurisdictions to have floodplain regulations and to require reforestation where there's massive deforestation.
Yeah. I'm not aware of any efforts, and that doesn't mean that they're not existing, but I'm just not aware of any. And it's a loaded issue. There's a lot of pros to that, and there's also a lot of folks that would find disadvantages with that. And so I think that would create a lot of interesting lobbying back and forth.
Well, I understand it'd be very tough politically.
Mm-hmm.
but it seems that if nothing is done on a state level, eventually it'll be a disaster.
Correct. So I think in the absence of regulations is what incentives can be put in place. And that's an open question that I think is worth looking into.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right.
My question is similar. First of all, I have to applaud you for all of the great work you're doing. I think you're preaching to the choir here somewhat. I want to know how all of these groups, and I belong to a group as well, Sussex 2030, how we can band together to put pressure on the county council to do the right thing. It doesn't do us any good to see all of your goals and objectives when the council is working in opposition to those goals. Every day they're approving new developments, clear-cutting forests, deforestation, ignoring the buffers, building in flood zones. We have petitioned, we have gone to county council meetings, we have written letters. None of it has an effect. So I'm at a loss, quite frankly, and we need the state and individual groups to step up and apply pressure to our local officials. And secondly, to DelDOT, I'd like to know their plans for evacuations because Route 1 is no longer an evacuation route.
Yeah. The first order of thank you. First order of evacuation planning is don't wait to be told to evacuate. If you have in our coastal area, you waited too long, because there will be traffic congestion. We have, few alternate routes. The best thing in evacuation planning is to evacuate ahead of time and just be proactive about it, and have your plan in place. Already know ahead of time where you're going to go. Know if they take your pets and those kind of things.
You can't even get up Route 1 in the summertime on a sunny day.
I hear you.
How far in advance do we need to plan?
Yeah, I hear you. I can't really, I don't want to get too far into politics, and we're in an election season.
It's all political.
Yeah, I think my best thought there is that the more that groups organize, the more that you field candidates, the more that you hold elected officials accountable, the more you find champions, look to other sectors and find champions in those sectors. Maybe you can get some traction.
But you're the organizations. You have clout, you have power, you have membership.
Well, I'm a university, so there's I'm not an advocacy group. So it's finding the groups that can do advocacy work, maybe to start out with. Yeah.
Hi. Well, I think you got a sense of what the political reality is from all the questions. I appreciate your presentation. And I very much agree with my colleague Steve that I think that the political answer here involves shifting more authority to the state level, because if it's delegated down to the local level, that's just another way of saying we're not going to do anything, frankly. But my question is sort of in the interim time. Steve and I are both members of the local planning commission. So Delaware is not an example, let's say, of a state where there has been the best use of planning and regulation in terms of coastal community. What are models? I mean, a state that doesn't have, for example, the home rule problem, or a state where, whatever the other structural factors are that are set up in a way that's different. So.
Yeah, that's a good question. And, kind of a broad question. I guess the first group that comes to my mind is Virginia Beach and Norfolk. Take a look at what they're doing. I personally don't know offhand about the home rule status there. I don't think that's the case, but they're doing a lot of good things with respect to flooding and sea level rise. Mm-hmm. And you can Google that. There's a lot of higher standards being put in place. that I think could be models for our area. I don't think our geography is all that different.
And what about from the federal level in terms of, do you see, are there new best practices or regulations or whatever that are in the pipeline? I noticed someone said that the floodplain maps have been recently redone, and so that's going to have.
Well, they're done in sections, right? So they're not like the whole area of coastal Delaware hasn't been redone in some time. But so there's, how do I answer that? So in FEMA is trying to turn the ship a bit. The ship has kind of you could say like some of the practices have sort of allowed redevelopment to occur in the flood zone, over time as different disasters occur. The regulated floodplain under the federal, flood insurance program is really there as a minimum standard, and they've come out and said that. They basically said, treat it as a minimum standard and plan to higher standards. So for example, like encouraging communities to adopt freeboard ordinances, which allow the living quarters of homes to be elevated above the base flood elevation or threshold of flooding that would occur under a 100-year storm. FEMA's trying to, also recalculate sort of flood risk through risk rating 2.0, which I encourage you to look up. They're factoring in new aspects like proximity to the water source. So they're doing things differently to try to address some of the growing risk. And then there's groups like the Association of State Floodplain Managers, so not really a federal government agency, but this is the network of state floodplain managers, and they come out with best practices all the time, and chief among that is don't build in the floodplain. And they talk about why, so I find that information really helpful. The American Planning Association has all kinds of best practices. There's a lot of material out there, and I'm happy to help connect community groups to that information.
So just one more quick question. Is there a schedule on which this area will be reassessed in terms of floodplain risk?
Do you know the answer to that? I don't know the schedule. I don't know what the schedule is now. Yeah, I mean there typically is. I don't know what that is. It doesn't happen as frequently as we may want. And it's interesting because a lot of the modeling that had been done in the past that goes along with the mapping doesn't really incorporate climate change into it. And I'm curious to see if FEMA kind of starts doing more of that. But it's tricky. It's not an easy procedure. Short answer is I don't know the timeline.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. And I didn't catch, since when have we had this 200% increase in population in Delaware?
Since 1960.
1960.
This is based on the 2020 census.
Okay. And in Sussex County, who is responsible for the emergency evacuation plan? Is it the county?
Joe Thomas, yeah, so he's the emergency manager for Sussex County.
Oh, okay.
And so he coordinates with the municipal authorities as well as the federal and state authorities.
And he's not part of the county, is he part of the county government?
Yes, he is. There's an emergency management center that he operates. And Joe's a good guy. He's a busy guy. They're also staffing the 911 call center, and they're dealing with the county-funded EMTs and so forth. So there's a lot of functions under him. And I think, frankly, they would benefit from a lot more employees for that. But you can reach out to him. He is responsible for coordinating with DelDOT and state and local authorities on evacuations and things like that.
Good. And I'd just like to make a couple comments that there is a new coalition called Sussex Preservation Coalition, and Sussex 2030 is part of it, and other groups are part of it. And part of the reason I came here today was to talk to the SOLA3 people about being part of it. So I do agree that we need to combine our groups. There's lots and lots of groups, and if we need to combine our groups in order to have a more authoritative voice in the county. And also, you know, I think that the county officials are so important, and if you know people in District 5 for the upcoming you know, primary, I think it's important to support who you think is the most environmental candidate. So, yeah.
Thank you.
I want to thank you for your presentation. I've been sort of part of the problem. I was in the state legislature for 24 years. How many folks here have been here for 20 years? Wonderful. How many members remember the storm of 62? Anybody remember that storm? Okay. Any of you who are interested in government, this is a booklet from the State Chamber of Commerce. It's free, or actually it's not free, it's $20 or something like that. But it has all the members of the government in all levels, all the cities, not the cities, the counties and the state. This is an election process that's unfolding right now, and I would encourage you to ask the questions at public sessions where the elected officials are talking to you about giving your vote. It's important that you let them know. I want to give you a piece of history about Delaware. The Nature Society, which is in Hockessin, Delaware, actually organized over 300 groups many years ago in the early 80s to create a thing called open space funding for the state of Delaware. That activity brought 300 nonprofit organizations together, and they asked the state to create a fund annually to buy open space to preserve and protect areas. That's been in existence. This past year, they not only had surplus money, but they added an additional $10 million. So they had $20 million this year for open space. But I would encourage you as a coalition and the young lady from 2030, I think it's important that you understand you have power, but you do have to create an image of a broader image than one group or two groups. If you give an image of 50 or 100 groups, it will impact them much better. I think that's an important step. I would also.
Do you have a question for the speaker?
Pardon?
Do you have a question?
I apologize.
No.
I think it's important that the university is an asset that we have not necessarily used as effectively as we could. Danielle happens to be affiliated with the University in Lewis, and that's important. But I do think at this point in time, the coalition of community groups is an important step, and I encourage you to join together and speak unitedly. It makes a difference. Thank you, Danielle.
Thank you, Dave. Okay, thanks, everyone.
Okay, maybe our next speaker can actually address some of the things that were, the questions that Danielle received, but we'll find out. And that is Steve Smailer, who is the director of DNREC's Division of Water. The division oversees the permitting of activities including water supply, wastewater disposal, docks and piers, and tidal wetlands. Steve has nearly 30 years of experience as an environmental program manager, consulting geologist, and natural resource analyst for projects throughout the Mid-Atlantic region, with specific concentration on coastal hydrology and water resource management. For over 2 decades, Steve's worked in both the public and private sectors, has primarily focused on assessing and managing the impacts of land use practices on the natural resources of Delmarva and the Mid-Atlantic region. Steve has been appointed by 3 governors to serve as president, vice president, and secretary of the Delaware Board of Professional Geologists and is a certified nutrient management consultant. And I'd like to say I'm very grateful to Steve for helping me better understand how our wetlands and subaqueous lands in and around our Rehoboth lakes are regulated, which I think he'll also share with us today, as well as the progress made on the Lakes Management Program. So, Steve Smailer.
Thank you. Thank you, Sally. Let me see if I can get.
Yep, I got it. All right, thank you for inviting me. I want to say it's the first time I've had an opportunity to be back in this building, all three of my children went through the old Rehoboth Elementary, but this is the first time I've stepped foot in the new Rehoboth Elementary. So, and realizing I'm the last speaker, I got to go to presentation mode. Realize I'm the last speaker before we're done. I'll try to be brief in my presentation. But I'm also going to do a little bit of an audible here in what I'm presenting versus tuning it a little bit to what I've heard today. My background, as Sally alluded to, I'm a coastal hydrogeologist. I would love to be sitting here speaking to you about one of the things that's near and dear to me that we didn't talk about at all, and that's the water supply issues that we have in the coastal communities. Tony, your point about the beauty of the beach brings us here, but if we don't have water to drink, we won't stay, right? That's one of my priorities, but it's not part of this presentation. Sally, when asked me to come here, one of the pieces, I think it's because of the conversations we've had over the years about defining the role that the department plays into the management of the lakes and the other aspects and how the regulations play into that. But I'm going to tweak it a little bit as I go through each of these slides because it's I say boring, it's regulatory, right? But it's what you need to know. But one of the things that I think is critically important here, and I've heard it at many levels, is what can we do, right? What can we do? I mean, I am here as part of DNREC. I am not DNREC, right? You guys are all here for a reason. There's a passion for why you're here. And I think it's critical as I go through this, I'm going to use specific regulatory examples about where my power, DNREC's power, stops and starts, where you can engage in some other aspects. I think it's vital. There was one of the earlier on, there's a question asked about where can you flex your muscles to get some of this stuff done? And I'm going to sit there and say what was going to run through my head at that point is there's muscles. In my world, muscles are the regulations and the laws that we have to enforce, right? There's leverage, and that's where we can apply funding. We can help, there's other pieces. And then there's assistance, and there's a lot of pieces there about the educational component that is where, we have the laws and the regs, and they're established, and there's a political process and a legal process to go through that. The leverage, the funding changes with each fiscal year, right? But the common piece there is the knowledge that we have the ability to share, and how we can help educate the various groups that were talked about to get that, not only that voice, a wider, broader representation, but also more specifically targeted at the issues, right? There's a lot of pieces, and I'll go through this as I go through the slides. So this is going through specifically right now. The slides are geared towards the regulation and what my division, Division of Water Resources does and does not do associated with activities on Silver Lake, Lake Comanches, Lake Girard. And I'll go through this and you can see it. So a couple pieces. The Division of Water section that oversees most of these activities was the Wetlands and Subaqueous Land section. We're reorganizing, renamed. Nobody could say or spell subaqueous, so now it's Wetlands and Waterways section. All right. They permit and authorize docks, dredging, shoreline stabilization. But in DNREC, Watershed stewardship does drainage. Tony talked a little bit about his previous history, water level management within the lake. Stormwater, they delegate certain aspects, dredging as a contractor. The Army Corps also has a component here, but going back in pieces of that, I'm going to jump into this right now because I think it's the only place I have on here that's about the management plan. As an example of how these work together, DNREC helped get the city of Rehoboth, Dewey, and Sussex County the funding to contract with the Army Corps to develop the Lakes Management Plan. Right? DNREC is not developing the Lakes Management Plan. We provided the Army Corps as the contractor to the local municipalities. We provided the funding. So that's the leverage, whatever we can do in that regard. Update as best I can give you on that is the Corps is committed to finishing that up by January of 2023 is my understanding. We've provided with them the information that we, the department, multiple levels, multiple sections, have provided them the information that they've requested as they're building that. One of the pieces of comments that we had going in was make sure you have stakeholder engagement as this goes to final development, goes to rollout, goes to other pieces. I know there's concerns about what that was up front. I can't speak to that per se because that's the Army Corps as a contractor to the local jurisdictions. But So, and I can direct you to the contacts I have for those folks, but I can't speak to the actual details of that. And then there's the other our partnerships with the local jurisdictions as well. This is where I'm going to pull a bit of an audible here in the context of jurisdiction. I think it's important, the education component, jurisdiction as it relates to the lakes. And there's the piece here. You see at the top, the Wetlands Act, I'd crossed that off. The state only has a tidal wetlands program. We have laws around tidal wetlands or non-tidal wetlands in excess of 400 contiguous acres. There's only 2 of those in the state, right? Not only that, so that's why that's crossed off, because there are no tidal wetlands around the lakes in Rehoboth, all right? The other piece where I'm going here a little bit offside is that figure up top, on top right, is a figure from the statutorily required mapping that was done with the Wetlands Act. We were required to map the tidal wetlands of the state, establish those maps, and those maps became jurisdictional. If somebody's trying to figure out whether they can or cannot do something in a tidal wetland, those maps are what say whether they are in or not in a tidal wetland. Those maps were last done in 1988, right? You start thinking about climate change, you start thinking about one of the more dynamic landscape features that we have in the state. A static map done in 1988 may not be the most appropriate now, yet that's law, all right? As an example, and that's where we get to. That's why it's crossed off. You still wouldn't have tidal wetlands in Silver Lake because it's non-tidal. If you have a freshwater wetlands program, maybe that would change. There's discussions about that piece. Subaqueous jurisdiction. Subaqueous is a fancy word for underwater, right? So in the state has jurisdiction in tidal water bodies. They have jurisdiction from the mean high water level down, and in non-tidal water bodies from the ordinary high water level, right? It's a critical element here because once you get 1 inch above that, 1 inch outside of that, that no longer applies. And we'll talk about that as I go through a couple of these slides. Other component is whether there's pieces about whether the state owns the land or there's private ownership. And that becomes a big issue, and people are always talking about, well, the state owns all the water in the state. No, it's not necessarily the case. And one of the components there is how that properties are defined. And I'm just going to use 2 examples. In this instance, it's out of a deed. One of the deeds is not from, maybe this is around here. It has a meets and bounds definition that there's actually the surveyed points and how you go this far and then you turn here and then you turn there. But then there are also definitions such as this where it says, said line being the center line of back channel gut as it existed in 1882. All right? Anybody know where back channel gut was in 1882? But it's one of the things, again, going back to the lakes, where one of the things I heard early on when I came back to the department was, well, aren't you going to tell us who owns every bit of the lakes and the other pieces? It's on a property by property, title by title deed, property description component. That's the equivalent of doing a title search on almost every single property that goes around there. And so what the department does is they look at this on a case by case basis and say, when this comes in, you're required to provide a survey and a deed, and this establishes where you own to. All right. The state still has jurisdiction, even if it's private lands. If your property extends into the water, the state still has jurisdiction, but they just don't own the subaqueous lands. And I'll go through a couple examples of this. The other key component here, before I get to the next slide, is when there's a narrative description like this. Now, this is to the center line of that gut, but you'll also often see aspects where it says to the meanderings of. The property is described as to the meanderings of. The meanderings aren't static, right? By that very term, they change. Here's an example. The registration from the county's parcels may not be perfect, but here's an example of established properties and the shoreline, what the shoreline's done underneath those, right? The people still own the property. That doesn't change, right? Well, I would say, I almost walk up there, depending on, I don't know what their deeds say, but depending on their description, if it's meets and bounds out into the water, they would still own the exact same square footage. If their property description is to the meanderings of Indian River Bay, they don't own that much, right? They own to the mean low water line as it recedes back, right? So I'm putting this is a little bit of a different spin on what I was talking about, but you put this in terms of climate change and what we're dealing with. This is where this hits some of this more, global piece hits the reality of where you're standing, right? Where you're looking at. I've had many a conversation with family members that talk on different sides of the spectrum about global warming or climate change or whatever you want to call it. And my father in particular, when I sit there and say, Dad, you can think what you want, but when I'm standing in water on what I used to stand on as ground, I have a differing opinion, right? So that's an example. Here's another example where you can see, if you can see the purple line, that property boundary was there when that parcel was recorded. That marsh retreating is significant, right? Other component here, as it relates to what I was talking about, the jurisdiction, the mean high water line, or the ordinary high water line. This is tidal water body, so this would be mean high. If a property owner gets a jurisdictional determination, that's what the state does, we'll go out and say, this is where your property starts and stops, this is where the end of the mean high water line is. If that mean high water line is established, we do not allow bulkheads on natural water bodies. You can go 2 inches inland and put up a retaining wall. So today's retaining wall will be tomorrow's bulkhead, right? But we don't have any jurisdiction beyond that. Once that line's established, we don't have upland jurisdiction. So it's a component that you need to understand in the expectations and the frustrations that are often expressed, because that's the physical reality of the legal components that are here in practice. And just these are just pictures, the same thing, looking at private, not private, it's a city, but ownership of Silver Lake as claimed versus, as claimed that's portions of it up top, and then the bottom left is the unclaimed portion. So there's other premise here is that ungranted, unclaimed subaqueous lands do belong to the state under the public trust doctrine. All right, so there's a component there. A couple pieces, going through now the process. Authorizations are required, whether it's public or private subaqueous lands. The private subaqueous lands caveat is if you have private subaqueous lands on your property that don't interact with other waters, it's a self-dug pond or whatever, we don't have jurisdiction there, right? When it connects into the other water bodies, we do. Another key piece here, which is often, again, it's lost because it's not in the regs. 1993 court decision, one of the corporations up north sued the state, but it established pretty substantially that it's actually a pretty interesting story. The riparian landowner, the person that owns the waterfront property, has a right to access their land from the water. It's not the right to access the water from the land, it's a right to access their land from the water. It actually goes back to, my understanding is, it goes back to how the eastern portion of the United States was colonized, right? They accessed the land from the water. They used the water to get to it. Western water law is almost the exact opposite as far as how West riparian rights go. But that's a key piece, because a lot of people say, we don't want that permit, or they oppose to somebody else's permit. I get that, but when the courts have said a property owner has the right to access their land from the water, we have to take that in consideration, and that's not explicitly defined in the regulations because that's case law. Right? Other piece, and Sally, I think this is where you and I first had a conversation about when I started at with the wetlands section, is in 2013, the state acknowledged we have to act when things are going on in Silver Lake, Lake Comegys, and other stuff. Before that, I think it was pretty much, predates me coming back, but it was expected that was a local land decision, not the state's engagement. Since then, we have issued permits and all the activities and the requirements that go through since that acknowledgement. Like I said this earlier, subaqueous lands permits, this is consistent. What goes on in these lakes is no different than what goes on in any other state water body. What we allow in any other state water body, it's consistent. New construction requires public notice. If you are interested in what goes on, you can request to be put on, if you're not already subscribed to the DNREC's public notice, notifications, do so, provide comments, but that's for new structures, for docks and piers. It would also be for dredging. It's any shoreline stabilization components. There's some criteria here about what we do in the terms of the size, and we can have more conversations about that. Repair and replace of existing structures, they do not require public notice, and if you're doing that above the water line, you don't even require authorization from it. But I have at the end, but ask. If you're not sure, ask as opposed to have a violation. All right. Other component that's pretty important on the lakes here, the concept of grandfathering. The Subaqueous Lands Act, 1968, if you had a structure in existence prior to 1968 that's maintained a serviceable footprint since then, it's a grandfathered structure that you're allowed to maintain in its configuration as it existed then. Key piece here, gazebos. Gazebos on Silver Lake. They're explicitly prohibited in the regulations now, right? But there are gazebos there, and they're allowed to repair them going through that component. So that's a key piece that is there. Other component, we also permit water withdrawals, but that's an issue in Silver Lake. An example of some prohibited activities, I have the caveat excluding grandfather structures. No houseboats. I sure hope we don't see houseboats on Silver Lake. Right? No gazebos, I said, except for grandfather. No restaurants, no residences. It's considered a natural water body. There are no bulkheads. The aspect, I talked about it earlier about retaining walls versus bulkheads. I say JDs, that's jurisdictional determination. The state is obligated to perform those. If you're doing any work on the water bodies, make sure you get that done. Don't assume anything. You assume something, it can actually get substantially costly. And I say, what's not us? I talked about this before too. So what not us is bad English. Non-tidal wetlands, we don't have a non-tidal wetlands programs. There's discussions about that, but that's a piece where that would require legislation. That would require, a actual change in how the state functions. Huge issue, buffers. So many times I've seen for docks and piers and all the other aspects, you can't let them do this. This is in the buffer. The buffer is beyond, by its very existence, is beyond state's jurisdiction, state's authority. I understand the concept there, right? But when those decisions, now what we do is we require, where there's buffer ordinances, we require proof that the project is compliant with the local municipality, the local jurisdictions, buffer ordinances, et cetera. Stormwater piece, from my division's perspective, and I know DNREC's a big agency and does a whole lot of different stuff, and very bureaucratically, it's always easy to say, that's not me, that's them, that's not that whatever. My program is responsible for permitting the outfalls, the actual structures in the water body, but not what goes through them. I think going back, Tony answered the question, I think Sally, I think that was what you had asked, about the water quality advisories and the other stuff coming from the outfalls. You said almost exactly what I would have said there. DNREC has no ability to regulate whether thrashers fries fall down in that storm drain and fester for 2 weeks. That's a process that's part of what's necessary to get the street cleaning and the local jurisdictions, the other pieces, the maintenance of those very catch basins and the other stuff, but that's beyond our authority. Right? I just have the shot up here for the website. Still doesn't have the new name. It still says Subaqueous. And I have my card with me. So just kind of going back, in summarizing, walk through and willing to discuss any of the specifics about, the regulations and what we do or don't do on Silver Lake, and Lake Gerard and Lake Comegys. But I thought it was really important hearing the conversation that we had as to understanding, why can't you do something about the buffers? Well, because we don't have legal authority to do so, but this is how we can coordinate, right? Why can't you do, why do you let them fill in the wetland? I hear that all the time. As far as the state's concerned, we don't have authority over non-tidal wetlands as a wetland, right? We don't let them fill in the tidal wetlands. For the acres of tidal wetlands that we have in the state, we average only about 20 permits a year 20 permits a year that we allow something to happen in state tidal wetlands, right? Nobody thinks that. They look at the other wetlands that are out there, and we think that the state lets them do whatever they want. I would say I understand that perception, but that's not where we have jurisdiction. Where we have jurisdiction, those 20 permits are because we don't allow much to happen, and most of those 20 permits are a wetland walkway to get from your upland to your dock. All right, those 20 permits do not, and I said another portion of it is to put a dredging pipe from the dredge to a disposal facility. And none of those, I don't want to say none, very few, if any of those permits have anything to do with allowing fill, because we don't allow fill in our tidal wetlands, right? There may be some pieces that are, there, if that does happen, there's mitigation components where they have to do 2, 4, whatever to 1, depending on what the project is. But that perception, I think, is a huge piece of, I'm using that as an example of the reality of the state DNREC doesn't care about wetlands versus what we actually do and what we can do in that regard. If that's something that I think is, and it is something that I think people are, I know people are, including myself, passionate about, that's a political process to change that, right? We don't have a non-tidal wetlands act, right? That's the reality of it. And I think that going back to what I said is the education, the component, and talking about how these groups, can be more educated to better target some of their actions, is that target should be based on the reality, the political and legal reality of the situation, and not just on the opinion, because once you start going in with a lot of these opinions, people stop listening because they know you're going to lose in a court of law, right? They know you're going to lose, when it comes to that's your opinion, but it's not either legal or it's procedurally incorrect. So educate yourself about some of these nuances on the critical elements that are vital to maintaining the things we need. And I think putting that in the context of climate change and the coastal environment we live in is a pretty creative endeavor in order for us to figure out how to make sure that, I'm going to use the example of the static tidal wetlands maps, right? That needs to change. That needs to change to deal with climate change, right? We have to start figuring out how to deal with that.
I just want to be sure I heard this correctly. The lakes are non-tidal.
Yes.
And regulated or not regulated, according to that.
Yes. Yes. They're considered non-tidal. Then they do fluctuate depending on the outfall structure, the elevation, but they're considered non-tidal.
Right. I want to get back to the Lakes Management Plan because, I was happy to see that you pointed out that we were responsible for actually doing the research that led to the decision by the Attorney General that the state has always owned these natural resources. And not long after that was 2012, and I think it was 2013, then DNREC Secretary David Small had a wonderful meeting that involved the whole community and, of course, SOLA. And he talked about what was ahead for that, and also that there would be regular meetings of stakeholders as the plans progressed. I found out about the current plan of having the 3 jurisdictions manage the lakes through a press release that came out from Rehoboth Beach. And that was, I think, in 2018. And I have gotten no information. We have not been invited to any of the meetings. I pressed the current manager, who is an employee of Rehoboth Beach staff, and I finally found out that there was a proposal, that there was a budget. I looked at that, I guess it was by project, and I looked at that, and some things on it were not correct. I tried to reach someone at I then found out about also the involvement of the Army Corps. I tried to find someone there. Several different names were referred to me. Nobody has ever gotten back to me. So now I'm really disturbed because you're saying that they seem to be finalizing this by 2023. So that's right around the corner.
So, I mean, I'll put it this way. I don't have it here with me, but I can give you the person at the Corps that's the project manager for that project, right? I can get you that contact information specifically. We are not, as the agency, we are not, just want to make sure you understand, at DNREC, we are not having regular routine meetings with the Corps on the project itself, right? We went through and said we provided the funding and the proposal looking at, the scoping, and does the scope match the funding is kind of where we got to. I know it's a little bit of, I'm kicking the can a little bit, I understand that, but the Corps is the consultant working on the management plan, and I can get you the proper contacts there.
Well, I think that makes us feel like stepchildren, because ultimately, the state owns the lakes. DNREC is required to do the management plan, but you've stepped away from that. So you can certainly correct me if what I'm concluding here is incorrect. But if there's no one even working with the current groups who are making the plan, how do you justify that?
Well, I think it's a couple pieces. So the state acknowledges that they own the ungranted, unclaimed aspects of the lakes, right? Other portions of lakes, so I'm splitting hairs here. Other portions of the lakes are privately owned, right? So, but that doesn't matter. In the aspect of going through, what's in the management plan, we have provided, I know from my programs, have provided the Army Corps with the information we have on the regulations, the statutes, the permits, the procedures that we have done, that's part of their decision to make it. I can't speak for what the other portions of the agency have done, but I can put you in contact with them. I know it's not what you want to hear, but I can tell you that we have given the Corps everything that they have asked from us on that process, and we have encouraged them to engage the stakeholders along the way multiple times. We are not the ones. We've given the money to the assemblage that is Rehoboth, Dewey, and the county. That's the ones that got the grant. Not we. The other divisions have. But in that context, we are not doing the work. We've facilitated and funded the work, and we've provided the information in a timely fashion every time we've been asked by the consultant doing the work. But we're not regularly meeting with them behind secret doors or closed doors. And I would love to, I'm absolutely hoping before the project is finalized, there's drafts, there's conversations. I don't know what the Corps' schedule is, but I can find out, who exactly the project officer is and provide that information to everybody.
Well, I think other than SOLA, people in the community, especially people who live around the lake, they want to know what's going on. And I don't know if there's any precedent for this where there has been decisions like this being made without input from the public. So I don't want to, beat a dead horse to death here, but I'm concerned that we're not going to have that input. As I said, I've tried, and it hasn't been forthcoming.
I can appreciate that. I think the only thing I would say slightly differently is, I'm not sure there are decisions being made versus there's a study being done and recommendations. That's a huge difference, right? Because I think there needs to be a starting point for some of those conversations. I know you wanted to be part of that more often, but I think that the decisions are it's premature to say the decisions are currently being made.
Well, except the alarm for me was when you said it would be finalized in 2023. So that doesn't give us a lot of time to have any input. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Great presentation. Thank you. Sally, I was also very perplexed by the January 23 date. As a city commissioner, we have heard absolutely nothing about it at this point. So I'd like to follow up with both of you and the city staff, and I think we need some answers, and we need to get all the stakeholders together.
And
so
I would say please do, because the Corps is working for you.
Yes.
Right? That's a key piece. The Corps is working for you. We got the funding for the towns to do the work. They are your contractor.
So I will absolutely ensure all of the stakeholders get together and we're getting answers on where we stand in that process. My question for you is, and it's going to be very pointed, and if you do not want to or can't answer, that's fine. Probably, I think 4 or 5 years, maybe less than that, 4 years ago, fountains were put in Silver Lake. Do you know how or why that happened? Oh, okay.
I mean, do I know how or why? No. Okay. Do I know that they went through a permitting process? Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Right, but we have no input on the how or the why.
We don't, at least the Board of Commissioners don't seem to know how or why that happened. It was, I think, done by the previous city manager. But my question is, we're now evaluating whether to, the need for those or whether they should stay or go, if there's any environmental issues. Could you tell us if is there any advantage from an environmental aspect of having them?
I don't know the answer. You can talk to things about like aeration and other components, but I don't know the necessity of it. Yeah. You know, I'm not saying that they are, but what I'm getting, I think the simplest place to start is get a copy. Let's get a copy of the permits.
Okay.
See who they were issued to,
okay.
And if they're issued to the town.
Yeah, I'm sure they were.
If they're issued to the town, if you have a permit for something, you no longer want it.
Yeah.
Kevin, what's the public works fellow?
Kevin Williams.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he was the one that got it going.
Okay. And my second question is, and Lake Jar, there is a lot of buffer. Silver Lake, not so much. Is there a particular reason for that? Okay. All right.
Because it's owned by the city.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
thank you, Sally. Because I mean, I can't speak. Remember, I said to me, we have no controls on the buffer, but the ownership of the land around it has the predominant control of everything, and Lake Jar has it.
Thank you. I would like to follow up on
Okay, I'll give you my
the
card.
cores.
Yep.
Thanks.
Hi. So, who is in charge of the bridge that goes across? Is that Department?
Tell us who you are, please.
What?
Tell us who you are.
Oh, my name's Rosemary.
Thank you.
I see people working on things, doing things out there. Where'd they come from? Who knows that?
I don't know. I would say there's two different things. Either it's DelDOT or it's a local jurisdiction. I don't know who it is.
So it's the county or the city or DelDOT?
I don't know whether the bridge. I don't know whether the bridge is in.
The bridge goes from the county to the city.
So to me, I don't know the answer. It's not DNREC.
Okay, that's good. And you're not in charge of the fountains either. So there we go.
Thank you, everyone.
Hi, I'm Tom Childers. I'm on the board of SOLA3 and vice president. It is my pleasure to introduce Michelle Schmidt. She's Director of Conservation and Watershed Planning for the Delaware Center for the Inland Bays. And as such, she engages communities and other partners throughout the watershed to identify and conceptualize projects that improve water quality and habitat and mitigate the effects of climate change. There are a lot of concepts in there. She has been with the Center for 5 years and has had the pleasure of working with many of the coastal and inland communities in this capacity. Michelle.
All right. Thanks, everyone. As was mentioned, I'm Michelle Schmidt. I'm the Director of Conservation and Watershed Planning. I was asked to talk about stormwater master plans today. And so, and I apologize, I'm a loud person in general, and there's a microphone in front of me, so if I end up screaming at you, just let me know. But anyway, so I'm going to talk about stormwater master plans. This will be somewhat different from the other topics you've covered, but it'll really cover some of why these plans are important. So I'm going to talk about what stormwater is, and why it's a problem, which sounds like we already know, talk about what a stormwater master plan is, and then I do have 2 examples that I will share with you. So as you all know, when land is converted from its natural state to roads, houses, development, whatever, it really changes the natural flow of water and its ability to soak into the ground. And so basically whenever you have precipitation, instead of slowly infiltrating into the ground, it is now rushing over the impervious surface, and it's looking for a way or an outfall or a place to go. So it's collecting sediment, it's collecting bacteria, it's collecting pollution, and it's carrying that with it to a couple of outfalls, wherever it can go. This is quite a problem because it's a non-point source, and non-point source is really tricky to handle. And I just wanted to show you this graph. It will be coming out in our upcoming State of the Bays report. Nitrogen is one of the pollutants that's picked up and carried by stormwater, and this is Rehoboth Bay. So some of Rehoboth obviously goes to, the stormwater runoff goes into the ocean. The other part goes into the Lewis-Rehoboth Canal and then into Rehoboth Bay. So this graph is showing you where we are at with achieving the total maximum daily load for Rehoboth Bay. We still are not there. So the TMDL is 968 pounds per day. And we are, you can see where we're at in compared to that 968. And so it was also mentioned as well, bacteria. That's another thing that gets carried with stormwater, the bird poop and all that jazz. And it's really difficult to control that non-point source pollution because we don't have an exact place where it's coming from. We don't know where the birds are all going to the bathroom. We don't know really what's happening. So that's why stormwater is a really big issue for pollution control. Another problem with stormwater and stormwater management, once you change the landscape, again, water doesn't have an easy place to infiltrate to, and so it tries to go into whatever drain there is, and it gets backed up. And then that leads to flooding. And then this is exacerbated when you have tidal flooding. This picture is from Dewey Beach. So Dewey Beach has a lot of tidal flooding on top of just flooding from stormwater. And so the ditches, get clogged, the storm drains get backed up, and not only is flooding inconvenient, but it's also, it's a safety hazard as well. And so one solution is to come up with a stormwater master plan. Stormwater master plans really are just a tool to protect life and property against flooding and then to protect water quality. And so really it's a plan to better understand what your current infrastructure is, where some of the problem areas are, and then you can use it to build different strategies to reduce flooding and environmental impact. The master plans will look different to each community depending on whatever your goals are. So if your main goal is flooding, it might look different from a plan whose main goal is reducing nutrients and sediment pollution. But they do typically include an inventory of the existing system, a quantification of the stormwater runoff and the associated nutrient pollution, the identification of flood hazards, and recommended improvements. So again, that could be for water quality, that could be for flooding, and then typically, depending on how robust of a plan you put together, it will include the cost of implementing your BMPs and different concept designs and all that jazz. Generally, these plans are developed using contractual support. So the examples I will show you in a few slides were done with contractual support, and there is grant funding available to develop these plans through DNREC. Their Surface Water Matching Planning Grant is what was used to develop the Dewey Beach Master Plan, which again, I'll show you in a couple of slides. And so one of the great reasons for having a plan is because it can be used to educate your residents on what some of the problem areas are and what they can do to help. And then it can also be used to develop a funding mechanism which can be leveraged for implementation. I will not lie, stormwater retrofits are not cheap projects, especially in a coastal community such as Rehoboth, because for various reasons, we're really close to the groundwater, and just in general, these projects are not cheap. So being able to use this to build different funding mechanisms is a really good, powerful tool. A few reasons, again, why this is particularly important for coastal communities to have. We are Delaware's a low-lying state, and we are also experiencing land subsidence. So basically, we are sinking on top of the seas rising. And so increased flooding from sea level rise is a very immediate threat. These plans can help you address some of those future issues, as all of our other speakers were basically discussing today. And then again, we are closer to the groundwater, and so water just naturally does not have a lot of space to infiltrate to. And so by implementing strategies to allow more water to infiltrate by removing pavement or whatever you decide to do is really important. And lastly, so in the Inland Bays Watershed, we do not have any MS4 permits. MS4 permits are designated based on population. And so we don't have the permit requirement yet, but as was mentioned, our population is growing. So if you develop a stormwater master plan now, you can sort of get ahead of the game. You can get some projects implemented before some of that grant funding becomes unavailable, because once it's a regulation, you cannot, there's very few grants that will fund that project implementation. So I don't want to go too far into the MS4 world because we don't have it yet, and therefore I'm not working with it and I'm not an expert, but it's a really good way to get sort of ahead of that game. So a couple of examples. I'm going to talk about Dewey Beach more so than the second example. Dewey Beach completed their first phase in 2013, and then they actually went and did a more an updated plan sort of in 2017. And so the center wasn't involved in phase 1, but we were involved in phase 2. We used RK&K as our contractual support. And again, we did get a surface water matching planning grant for this project. And so phase 1 really was more of an inventory of what the existing stormwater infrastructure was, and it went and described what the different drainage basins were. It also identified the different project needs based on a TMDL analysis, so it really looked at what the nutrient pollution was, what the nutrient pollution was for each drainage basin. Phase 2 took all of that information and developed more of a actual plan with specific BMPs for each drainage basin. It involved concept designs, a cost estimate for implementation, and also discussed some funding mechanisms that could be used to implement the different projects. And so the end result was 35 projects. I know I have 30 here, but that might not be correct. And I know this is kind of hard to see, but the project area is 142 acres, and so it doesn't cover all of Dewey Beach. It really just covers the southern portion of Dewey Beach. And it also included 2 living shoreline projects, bioretention areas. It really went through each different drainage basin, looked at what the problem areas were and what the various solutions were. So here's a close-up of the Collins Street drainage basin. You can see, hopefully highlighted, where all of the different project locations are. Where it says BR, that's a bioretention facility, and where you see PA, that's porous asphalt. So a lot of the recommendations were to replace concrete with porous asphalt. And same with sidewalks, same with some parking areas. And then also replacing the medians with more porous material, whether that was a mulch bed or whatever. And so Dewey Beach is still working on implementing this plan. The center has partnered with Dewey Beach to do one of the bioretention areas, which is in front of Little Store if you drive past We also installed the Reed Avenue Living Shoreline. Within this plan, there were 2 stormwater outfall BMPs as well, and so the Reed Avenue was not only a living shoreline, but we also upgraded the stormwater outfall. And so we're still working with them to develop a plan to continue implementation. We knocked off like the cheaper projects and now have the expensive ones left to handle, so we're working through how to get that funding. The second example I'll give you is the Anchorage Canal pollution and stormwater control strategy. I will say this is a plan that was developed more focused on pollution control, not necessarily flooding. And I also want to note that this was developed in 2010 and we just finished implementing it in 2021. So these plans take a while to actually implement because they are robust and the projects take a lot of coordination. You got to get the funding and all that jazz, but that's why it's also good to have one now so that you can start working on it. But this plan conceptualized different types of projects compared to the Dewey Beach one. This included a couple of sediment forebays at the beginning of a couple of the canals. It did, of course, include bioretention areas, but those are really in the median. So when you're driving down Bethany, South Bethany, and you're looking at the very nice medians, a lot of those were concrete, and now they're beautiful. And they're bioretention areas, so they are helping to clean up the water. A lot of their ditches were also converted to wet swales, and that's something that looks really nice also. And then they simply replaced stone around their inlets with native grasses. That was a pretty easy BMP, best management plan. So I went through this quickly because I know we've had a lot of discussion today, but just in summary, stormwater master plans really provide a roadmap for communities to handle stormwater, not only today, but in the future. A lot of our stormwater infrastructure in our area is aging or already, pretty old, and so it's good to go through and update those. But you need a plan, right? You can't just think that you're gonna go and update your whole stormwater system. As I said, the Anchorage Canal plan took 10 years to implement. And you need to figure out not only what you're gonna do and how you're gonna do it, but how you're going to fund it. And so it's a really good tool to start working on as soon as you can. So again, that was really quick. But I am happy to answer any questions if anybody has any.
So we saved the best for last. I'm on the Stormwater Task Force for the City of Rehoboth, and my first question was, where is our master plan? They have projects, but they don't have any plan. So has anybody from the Rehoboth ever contacted the Inland Bays about what you've done in Dewey? And because I'm just shocked, that we don't have a master plan and we still don't have one. We just have projects. Mm-hmm. The other thing is, I saw you said that you're recommending permeable asphalt. Have there been improvements in it? Is it working well? Do you know?
Yeah, so to answer your first question, to my knowledge, nobody from Rehoboth has approached us about a stormwater master plan, and we're happy to discuss any and all options with anybody. For the second question, so there's a lot of opinion on porous asphalt. There's a lot of different materials you can use. I will say the center, at the Center for Inland Bays office, we have a permeable parking lot. And it's amazing when it rains, to look at our parking lot versus like right next door, the rest of the parking lot. I mean, that works really well. I believe the town of Bethany Beach also was installing or was replacing some of their area with permeable asphalt. I'd have to follow up with you, but I'll look into that and see if I can give you that example.
Well, I know they use it all over Florida.
Yeah, I mean, so it works great from our point of view. I mean, we know there's a maintenance aspect to it. It is more expensive, but it does work.
Okay, mm-hmm. And you've given through freezes with it too, so it's
yeah, we've
perfect.
had our parking lot for, definitely been there longer than me, so 6, 7,
Okay.
8, 9, 10 years, something, yeah.
Okay, thank
Yeah.
you so much.
Yep.
This is more of a comment to the community, and I've talked a little bit about with you about it. But SOLA3 has provided extensive comments and recommendations to the city through the comprehensive development plan, and we've done that in the past, and things haven't gone anywhere. So, those of you who live in around Rehoboth, we really need to work with your elected officials to get this done, because we know now all the benefits of what this can do. It's sort of hypocritical that the task force is talking about pervious surfaces for homeowners, but when we've talked to them using the budget that they have to pave streets, to do pervious, they don't do that. So just the impact of, or the benefit of having such a plan is so tied into our whole protections from climate change and sea level rises. So we really need to get going on it.
Absolutely. Anyone else? Anyone else? Awesome. Thank you all so much.